In the richest garden in the city, a woman bent to eat what even animals refused. When a billionaire found his maid eating grass, he didn't see poverty at first, he saw offense. But truth grows in places pride refuses to look, and that morning, his world began to crack. The Langston estate stretched across 50 acres of manicured perfection. The grass was imported, the roses engineered to bloom in every season, and the fountains whispered wealth with every drop. Edward Langston believed in control. Every blade trimmed, every worker accounted for. He owned skyscrapers downtown, oil shares abroad, and silence at home. To him, stillness meant success. But that morning, stillness carried a strange sound, a faint, wet rustle beneath the song of birds. It was the sound of someone chewing. He was standing on the terrace, a phone pressed to his ear, half listening to a meeting about profit margins. "Cut another 3%, he said flatly, watching the sun climb over the hedges. But as he spoke, his gaze caught a figure by the tulip beds, small, dark, and bent low to the ground. He narrowed his eyes. "Hold on," he muttered, lowering the phone. There, in the middle of his pristine garden, Grace Ndlovu knelt in her faded uniform, her hands trembling as she plucked grass from the soil. She pressed it to her lips and chewed slowly, her face calm, her movements deliberate. Edward's heart jolted. He blinked twice, unsure if he was seeing right. The image refused to make sense. He started down the marble steps, each one echoing with disbelief. The closer he got, the clearer it became. She wasn't gardening. She was eating. "Grace." His voice cracked across the morning air. She froze, then turned her head slowly, the sunlight painting her eyes gold. For a moment, she looked like a startled deer, but there was no fear, only shame she tried to hide behind dignity. "Mr. Langston," she said softly, standing up, brushing dirt from her knees. He stopped a few feet away, the smell of wet grass between them. "What are you doing?" His tone was sharp, more accusation than concern. "Are you eating that?" Her lips parted. She hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, sir." He frowned, confused and offended. "Why?" Her answer came quiet as confession. "It helps me forget the hunger." For a moment, time fractured. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine, the distant hum of sprinklers, the soft chirping of birds. All ordinary things, but now they felt unreal. Edward blinked, unable to process the words. "The hunger," he repeated. She lowered her gaze, voice trembling. "We haven't had proper meals for days, sir. Not since the kitchen was closed to staff. The others, they saved their portions for their children. I just needed something to stop the pain." He stared at her, stunned. He wanted to say it was impossible, some misunderstanding. His house overflowed with food, his refrigerator, his pantry, his chef's menu. Yet she stood there, thin and trembling, chewing the earth beneath his fortune. He ran a hand over his face, a surge of guilt fighting through disbelief. "Grace, why didn't you tell anyone?" "I didn't want to shame the house," she whispered. "You've been good to us, Mr. Langston. I didn't want to seem ungrateful." Her humility stung worse than accusation. He turned away abruptly. "Go inside," he said, his voice breaking in places he didn't understand. "We'll talk later." She nodded and walked toward the servants' quarters, her steps slow and steady. The back of her neck glistened in the sun. He noticed her shoes, thin soles splitting open. When she disappeared inside, Edward exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. He looked down at the patch of grass where she'd been kneeling. The earth was wet, dark, and uneven now, a wound in his perfect lawn. He turned back toward the mansion, its glass windows reflecting his face like judgment. Inside, he found Maria, his daughter, perched on a velvet sofa, scrolling through her phone. "Dad, your gardener's crying outside," she said without looking up. "Something happened." "She's not the gardener," Edward muttered. "She's my maid." "Whatever. What's wrong with her?" He hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. She was eating grass. Maria laughed, almost spilling her coffee. "You're joking." "I wish I were." "That's disgusting," she said, wrinkling her nose. "You should fire her. That's mental." Edward's jaw clenched. "Maybe it's hunger." "Hunger?" She scoffed. "She gets paid, doesn't she?" He didn't answer. Something in her tone, so careless, so cold, made him look at her differently. His daughter had never known need. She'd grown up surrounded by plenty, insulated from consequence. Maybe that was his doing. He left her in the room, her laughter fading behind him like static. In the afternoon, he walked through the servants' corridor, a place he hadn't entered in years. The walls were yellowed with time, the air thick with heat. He found the pantry door ajar and stepped inside. Empty shelves. The only thing in sight was a dented pot of rice, a few canned beans, and half a loaf of stale bread. The refrigerator buzzed weakly, its light flickering. Inside, nothing but a bottle of water and an old apple. Edward's throat tightened. His own dining hall, just one floor above, had hosted feasts worth thousands. Now, below it, people were starving under his roof. He sat on a wooden stool, the same one Grace probably used, and pressed his hands against his face. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt small. He thought of the cost-cutting meeting a month earlier, the one where he approved internal efficiency adjustments. He had closed the kitchen staff's access to the main supply to save overhead. The numbers had looked clean on paper, but those numbers had turned into hunger in real life. He rose abruptly and called his assistant. "Kendra," he said sharply, "when did we cut the staff meals?" Her voice hesitated through the line. "A little over 3 weeks ago, sir. It was part of the household efficiency program you approved." His chest ached. "And nobody told me the staff had no food." "We assumed they'd make arrangements," she replied carefully. He hung up before he could curse. That night, he stood again by the terrace. The moonlight painted the garden silver, the same place where Grace had knelt. He couldn't get the image out of his mind, the sound of chewing, the calm in her eyes, the quiet shame that didn't beg for pity. He poured himself a drink, but couldn't swallow it. His reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, cold eyes, drawn lips, an empire built on blindness. He thought of his mother, years ago in a one-room shack, boiling water to fill the hunger. "It tricks the stomach," she used to say. "Makes you forget what you don't have." He had forgotten. The next morning, the house was silent when he came downstairs. Grace was already working, her uniform pressed, her movements slow but deliberate. She polished the piano keys, humming a hymn under her breath, a melody that trembled like hope refusing to die. "Grace," he said softly. She looked up, startled. "Yes, Mr. Langston?" He paused, words heavy on his tongue. "Did you eat today?" She smiled faintly. "Not yet, sir. But I will." He wanted to say more, to apologize, to promise change, but pride choked the words. Instead, he just nodded and left the room, her quiet following him down the hall. Outside, the sun rose again over his perfect garden, but he knew it wasn't perfect anymore. Not after what he'd seen. In the richest garden in the city, something had broken open, not just the soil, but the heart of the man who owned it. And as Grace's voice drifted through the mansion like prayer, Edward Langston felt the first crack of something unfamiliar, yet necessary, compassion. He didn't know it yet, but that single moment of hunger would unearth every lie he had buried in comfort. Morning arrived with a muted kind of light, the kind that slips past curtains like a secret and lays carefully on expensive things. The Langston estate woke in hushed routines, the soft scurry of slippers in the servant corridor, the clink of china, the hum of distant vacuuming. But something in the air felt offbeat, as if a great house were trying to breathe without lungs. Edward moved through the halls with a deliberate calm he rehearsed at stockholder meetings. He didn't trust his heart this morning, so he wore his body like a suit of armor. He paused at each threshold and watched quietly as the staff glided in practiced silence. They were ghosts in his home, visible only to the work they finished. He realized he could not name half of them. In the pantry he had visited yesterday, he found a single addition, a bowl of porridge, thin as a whisper, sitting on the counter with a spoon laid beside it like a prayer. Nurse Clotilde's work, he guessed. She had that way of setting dignity on a table and daring the world to knock it off. He lifted the spoon, then set it down again. He didn't know if it was meant for him or someone else. He didn't want to take what was not his to take anymore. He found Clotilde in the laundry room, steam rising around her like low clouds. She moved with elegance, folding shirts in precise rectangles, smoothing collars that would later lean over power and never look down. A silver cross glinted at her neck. When she glanced up, her eyes were unafraid. "Good morning, Mr. Langston," she said, voice low, the accent of a life lived in 2 countries. "Morning," he replied. "Clotilde, may I speak with you?" She nodded to a corner where a chair sat, its cushion worn by patience. He remained standing. "I need to understand," he said. "About the food. About Grace." Clotilde's hands didn't stop folding. "You approve changes, sir." The changes arrived. We adjusted. Adjusted into hunger. The question came out sharper than he intended. Her eyes flicked to his and back to the linens, soft as apology. Hunger is clever. It knows how to hide in polite houses. He swallowed. Why didn't anyone say anything to me? Directly. Because you are an ocean away, even when you are in the room, she said, gently, not as an accusation, but as factual as laundry. People who clean your floor should not be asked to swim to you. It landed. He felt it physically, like a hand pressed to his sternum. What about Grace specifically? Clotilde's mouth tightened. Grace will tell you in her own time, if she chooses. But know this, she saves more of her pay than you think. Sends it back home. She eats less so someone else can eat more. He closed his eyes briefly. I can fix this. The word stumbled over pride and landed in humility. I want to fix this. Good, Clotilde murmured, folding the last shirt with ceremony. Begin with seeing. Begin with asking names. Begin with making a kitchen that feeds people before it feeds the chandelier. He left the laundry room changed by a simple thing, the realization that solutions begin where attention goes. He walked straight to the main kitchen and summoned the house manager, a blond man in a crisp shirt whose name lapsed on Edward's tongue until the man supplied it. Trevor, the manager said. Trevor, Edward repeated. Household policies changed last month. The staff meal plan was removed. Trevor shifted. Consolidated, sir. The budget for staff meals was reallocated to maintenance. How much did we save? Edward asked, already dreading the answer. Roughly $1,800 a month. 1,800. He paused, pressing the number quietly against the scale of his wealth. He had spent more than that on a single bottle of wine for a client he did not like. His face warmed with something like shame's cousin. Effective today, he said, voice steady, restore the staff meal program. Add breakfast. And I want fresh produce delivered here by noon. Vegetables, fruit, good bread. Trevor blinked. Of course, sir. And Trevor, Edward added, the words rising unexpectedly from the better part of him, I'll be taking my breakfast here. In the staff kitchen. Yes. He inhaled. If that's all right with the staff. Trevor's surprise softened into respect. I'll make arrangements. Word travels in a big house the way wind travels through tall grass, whispering, gathering, rushing through places it's never been. By late morning, the staff knew the kitchen would open again. Some greeted the news with relief edged in suspicion, because kindness in rich houses sometimes arrives like weather, pleasant one day, storm the next. Edward retreated to his office to face a different weather. Jaden Brooks, his young financial advisor, waited in a charcoal suit and a calm that hid sharpness. Jaden's gaze was steady. It had to be. He spent his days telling the truth to powerful men. I hear you're changing household policy, Jaden said after the necessary pleasantries. Trevor pinged me for budget. I'm changing more than that, Edward replied. But yes, start with meals. Jaden nodded. The line item is small. The story behind it is not. Edward almost smiled how cleanly Jaden cut tomato. I found Grace in the garden yesterday. Jaden's face didn't move. How was she? Hungry, Edward said. Eating grass. There was a silence in which two men stood on opposite shores of a truth and stared. Jaden's jaw clenched barely, some memory flashing across his eyes that chose not to name itself. Okay, Jaden said finally. Then this is not a kitchen issue. This is a culture issue. I know, Edward replied, surprised to hear himself mean it. Help me change it. Jaden slid into a seat. Start with structure. Staff reporting should bypass middle layers that are incentivized to keep things quiet. Empower a liaison, someone trusted. Raise the baseline wage. Offer emergency food stipends. And, this may be the most important, be seen. Sit in the room you've never sat in. I plan to have breakfast with the staff today, Edward said. Jaden's eyes softened with something like respect. That's a start. I'll draft the rest. They spent an hour turning ideas into plans. For the first time in weeks, Edward felt a kind of movement that didn't involve money, but meant more than any deal he'd made. When he stepped into the staff kitchen at noon, the room fell into a hush. The air was thick with the scent of simmering tomatoes and garlic, the comfort of butter melting on fresh bread. People sat on plastic chairs with careful spines, the posture of those who'd learned to make themselves smaller than their hope. He recognized Clotilde. He recognized Trevor. And then his breath found its center. Grace was at the far end of the table, hands folded, eyes lowered, the shadow of yesterday still resting on her shoulders like a shawl she could not shake off. "May I sit?" he asked, and the staff looked at one another as if to confirm. Was this a test or a meal? Clotilde motioned to the chair across from her. "Sit." He sat. A plate appeared in front of him. Stew, bread, a slice of melon bright as a new promise. He looked up. Grace's eyes met his, and he saw the flicker of conflict there, a dignity that stiffened against pity, a humility that refused to kneel to it. "Grace," he said, speaking her name like a first step, "I am sorry." The room did not exhale, but it felt like it might. She inclined her head. "Thank you, sir." He took a spoonful of stew and chewed slowly, tasting the same food they tasted, feeling it move through the same body that had once insisted on difference. He remembered the trailer park kitchen of his childhood, the thin soups and thick silences, and wondered how he had ever let that memory slip so far away. Maria arrived at the doorway like a cold front. She wore white today, the kind of white that dares you to touch it. She scanned the room and found her father at a staff table with a plastic spoon in his hand. The expression on her face was shock decorated with scorn. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice pitched for an audience beyond the door. "Eating," he said. "With them." Her eyes flitted over the staff as if they were a single object that offended her. "With my employees," he corrected. She laughed brittle. "And what is this? A performance? You're a billionaire, Dad. You can set up a fund and do a press release. You don't have to cosplay charity." A muscle in his cheek twitched. He set his spoon down gently. "This is not charity." "Then what is it?" "Correction," he said, "beginning with me." The room pretended not to listen, but could not help it. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. Clotilde watched the two as one watches a storm over a field they have to harvest by sundown. Maria shook her head. "You're embarrassing yourself." "I've been embarrassing myself for a long time," he said, surprising himself with the honesty. "You just didn't see it." The door hummed with air conditioning and tension. Maria curled her lip, then turned on her heel. Her perfume lingered as she left, a floral insistence that everything was fine. After lunch, Edward asked the staff to stay. He stood, feeling the shake in his voice and letting it stay. He'd hidden his tremors for too long. "I want to apologize," he began. "I approved a change that led to people going hungry in my home. That is on me. I cannot undo yesterday, but I can choose differently today. Meals are restored. Wages will be reassessed. You will have a direct line to me through a liaison we will elect together. No one will be punished for speaking." Eyes flicked to one another, to the floor, to the ceiling. People do not trust promises made from a height until they have climbed down and stood among them long enough to be tired. A hand rose, thin fingers, careful nails. It belonged to a dishwasher named Dev, whom Edward had never noticed beyond a uniform. "Sir," Dev said, voice trembling into bravery, "what about the overtime you cut last winter?" "We lost 2 rents that way." "Bring me the numbers," Edward said. "We'll fix it." A murmur moved through the room like a breeze. Hope is a fragile animal. It must be approached without sudden movements. After the meeting, people dispersed like seeds after first rain. Edward found Grace in the hallway outside, where light fell in generous rectangles across the floor. "May I walk with you?" he asked. She nodded, and they walked in silence past framed paintings of oceans Edward had paid to stare at but never swum in. They reached the service exit where the garden began again in curated abundance. "Mrs. Ndlovu," he said, choosing her last name with respect, "I would like to understand what I never asked. Your schedule, your responsibilities, your needs. Not as my property, as my responsibility." Her smile was faint, but it reached her eyes. "Grace is fine, Mr. Langston." "Edward is fine," he said, shocking himself and liking the shock. She tucked a stray thread back into her sleeve. "It's not the first time I've been hungry," she offered, tone even, more history than complaint. "But it's the first time hunger tasted like shame." He braced himself. "Because it happened here." "Because I thought I had outrun it," she said. "Where I come from, we know how to share a pot. Even when there is little, someone finds a way to add water, add salt, add laughter. In big houses, hunger is quiet. It wears shoes." He felt that too deeply to speak. They stood for a moment in the doorway, watching gardeners, well-fed men, trim hedges to the exact curve of a design he had chosen from a magazine. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. She considered. It is difficult to ask a man for bread when he hangs bread as decoration and does not notice. He nodded once, absorbing it whole. Grace, would you? He stopped, reconsidered, tried the word again. Would you help me? Advise me. If you're willing. I don't want to fix what I don't understand by breaking something else. Her eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, but with the gravity of a road turning where it never had. I can tell you what we feel, she said. I cannot promise you will like it. I don't need to like it, he said. I need to hear it. A gust lifted the leaves and let them fall again in a green hush. Somewhere, a fountain spoke a language of water he had never learned. They returned inside. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking the map of his own home for the first time, the cramped room where 2 housekeepers shared a mattress and a calendar of overtime denied, the storage closet that should have been a break room, the staff bathroom with a leaking sink and a taped sign that said out of order 2 months too long. He took notes. He stopped to listen. In stopping, he made space for sound he had never let exist. By evening, Maria found him in the study, the desk covered in scribbles, wages, repairs, contact names. Her expression had cooled from storm to frost. You can't save everyone, she said. I never tried to, he answered. That's the problem. She stepped closer, softer. Dad, where is this coming from? You used to tell me that if we start answering every sob story, we'll drown. He looked up at her. I told you that because I was afraid. I thought compassion would cost me power. But power without compassion cost me something worse. Maria looked at the lists, at the weary slump in his shoulders. Love complicated her certainty, and she didn't know how to hold both. And what does any of this have to do with that woman? The one in the garden? Everything, he said. Her name is Grace. The name did something to the air. Maria exhaled slowly. So what now? Now, he said, I sit with what I should have heard years ago. And I change the house. Then the way we run the business. Then, he stopped himself. 1 room at a time. When the house stilled that night, a new kind of quiet settled, less of a hush imposed from above, more of a breath held in anticipation. In the staff corridor, someone taped up a simple sign above the pantry door, meals, 8 a.m., 12 p.m., 6 p.m. Underneath, in neat penmanship that looked like gratitude learning to trust itself, someone added, Thank you. Grace returned to her small room and sat on the edge of her bed. She opened the Bible that held her letters, and tucked inside was a folded photograph, a classroom in Zimbabwe, children with shining faces, chalk dust caught in a golden beam. She traced their outlines and thought of stew and a billionaire with a plastic spoon, and eyes that finally learned to lower themselves without going dark. Edward went out to the garden alone. He found the patch where she had knelt. The grass, flattened yesterday, began to rise again in thin green fingers. He crouched and pressed his palm to the soil. It was cool and forgiving, as if the earth knew something about failure and return that men took longer to learn. Above him the sky dimmed, and the garden lights came on, soft orbs punctuating the dark like a constellation someone had ordered from a catalog. He looked past them, into the real night. He didn't know what tomorrow would require. He only knew silence had been too expensive, and he could not afford it anymore. Night in the big house pressed its ear to the floor and listened. Pipes clicked like distant insects. The humidifier hummed a false ocean. Somewhere in the servants' corridor, a quiet laugh moved through the air, thin but real, the sound of stew settling into grateful stomachs. Edward lay awake, eyes open to the ceiling's ornate stamp, wondering how something so beautiful could look like a lid. He felt sealed in, preserved, almost pickled by success. In another wing, Grace turned a folded photograph over in her hands. Children in a sunlit classroom smiled at the camera with chalk-dusted fingers, uniforms patched, eyes bright as rain. She slid the photo back into her Bible, to the page where Psalm 23 had softened from years of thumb and tear. The Lord is my shepherd. She had taught this to a room of 30 children under a corrugated roof, while the wind pushed dust through the cracked windows and made the words feel like a promise forged in a furnace. Sleep took them both in fits, which is to say not at all. By dawn, Grace's memory had decided it was time to walk. It rose from its chair, like an old friend, and led her back across the ocean by the hand. The morning light in Bulawayo had been different, sharp and honest, bright enough to show you what you had, and what you didn't. In that light, a much younger Grace chalked the alphabet on a blackboard rescued from a closed school, her smile as steady as the line of letters. A, B, C. Each stroke sounded like a small door opening. The children repeated after her, their voices a patchwork choir. After class, she would sit with the mothers, share sadza if there was maize meal that week, and talk about hopes that refused to shrink just because the currency did. The notes in her purse had lost value so fast that she once used them as scraps to write spelling words when the exercise books ran out. The country turned their money into paper. Grace turned paper into lessons. She could make anything do what it wasn't meant to do if it could help a child read. The day everything began to untie, the clinic door had been locked with a chain, and no one had keys. Inside, the vaccine fridge hummed, but the nurse never came back from the city. Outside, men sat on low stools and talked of jobs that had vanished like breath on cold glass. A new drought took the river in its fist and wrung it dry. Prices yawned open like a lion's mouth and did not close. When the school closed for good, Grace wrapped the chalk in tissue, like bone of something holy, and placed it in the tin that once held biscuits for visitors she no longer had. She went to the agency 2 towns over and slid her papers across the desk. Her degree had gotten her this far. The woman behind the glass looked at it, and then at Grace and said, "Do you want work or your history respected? We only have one to give." She swallowed her dignity in one brave mouthful and said, "Work." The agency promised a house in America and respectable work. Domestic services, they called it. Clean words for cleaning. She signed forms with a pen that didn't work at first. She shook it until ink reluctantly flowed. On the bottom line, she wrote her name with the care of someone laying a cornerstone. Ndlovu, elephant. She had always liked that, animals that remembered the path to water even in drought. That night she told her sister, who touched Grace's face like a map. "You will send money," her sister said, meaning it as a question and a prayer. "I will send more than money," Grace said. "I will send proof that the world is bigger than this pain." On the plane, she pressed her forehead to the window and watched the continent become fabric under light. When she landed, the air smelled like metal and rain and coffee. In the first boarding house, she learned the choreography of other women's survival, the knot of a headscarf that didn't slip, the way to line-dry uniforms in a room with no sun, the recipe for hope that tasted like tea with too much sugar. She learned which buses to take to rich neighborhoods, which hallways to avoid, and how to make herself less visible than the mirrors she polished. Her first job ended when the lady of a house found a hairpin on a marble floor and decided it was insubordination. The second ended when a child threw a tantrum, and the father needed to show someone he still had thunder. By the time she found the Langston estate, her passport had more fingerprints than stamps. The house manager smiled with lips and counted hours with eyes. "Discretion is key," he said. "We provide meals at the staff kitchen." He did not say, "Until we don't." On her second week in the Langston house, she discovered the piano felt like old friends under her cloth. On her third, she learned Edward's coffee preference and Maria's allergy to pity. She carved out small corners of dignity, a hymnal hummed under breath, an extra pillow placed for a long day, sending a wire transfer every 2 weeks even when the wire felt like a vein that might not hold. In the present morning, after the new meal announcement and the strange kindness of a billionaire with a plastic spoon, Grace dressed slowly. She felt the ache of pride loosen, like a braid at the end of the day. She set water to boil on the hot plate in her room, not for tea, but for the ritual of steam. She held her face over it and breathed until the world softened around the edges. Across the house, Edward opened a box he had not opened in years. It was not labeled. Wealthy men like him didn't need labels. They had people who remembered things for them. He lifted a stack of photographs, a boy in a faded t-shirt, a bicycle with duct-taped handlebars, a mother whose smile held back a flood. He could almost smell the old vinyl booth of the diner where she worked nights, the fat and coffee and lemon cleaner. He remembered the night the landlord slid an envelope under their door. Final notice. His mother had leaned against the sink and laughed in a way that made his chest hurt. Laughter was her last defense. He walked to the corner store and stole a loaf of bread wrapped in plastic that squeaked under his jacket. He ate half in the alley, washing it down with pride he could not swallow. He brought the rest home and placed it on the table. "Look what I found," he lied. His mother's eyes found the lie and did not shame him for it. She cut the bread into small pieces and blessed it with her hands like communion. They dipped it into soup made of water and garlic and the stubborn part of a carrot. Edward had grown himself on a diet of ambition and shame, one feeding the other until he could not tell which part of him was hunger and which part was teeth. He built his empire from the memory of that stolen loaf and erected high walls so no one could see the boy who once hid in an alley to eat. In his business, he learned to make people small enough to fit into spreadsheets. He did it so expertly, it felt like the only way to live. Grace's kneeling in the garden had reached back and lifted that boy by the collar of his shirt and set him in front of the man he had become. Now they stared at each other across the mahogany desk. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't dialed in 20 years. Harris's Diner, a woman's voice sang, still buttered with Georgia. "We're open from, Mrs. Harris," he interrupted softly. "It's Eddie Langston." Silence turned into a shout. "Lord, boy, are you alive?" "I think so," he said, and surprised himself by meaning it less than he wanted. "You still making those biscuits?" "For people who deserve them," she said, laughter in her throat. "You coming by?" "I can't," he said, "but I wanted to say thank you. For the extra bowl of stew when my mother worked late. For letting me sit in the back with homework and pretending not to see." "You were always a good boy," she said. "I'm trying to be a good man," he answered. "Then feed people," she said, as if she were giving a recipe requiring no measurements. "That's the whole thing." After the call, he stared at his reflection in the black screen. His face looked like a map of cities that no longer existed. You cannot go back to them, he told himself. But you can build something quieter in their memory. At mid-morning, Grace visited Nurse Clotilde's room with a jar of jam she'd saved from a church pantry. "For your bread," she said, placing it down as if it were a jewel. "You should keep it," Clotilde said. Grace smiled. Keeping everything is how hunger wins. They sat on the edge of Clotilde's bed, knees touching, two women sharing a small platform large enough to hold the world if they balanced carefully. Clotilde threaded a needle and fixed a missing button on Grace's cuff. "He looks different today," she said. "Different how?" Grace asked. "Like a man who found out the door he's been guarding leads back to his own house," Clotilde answered. "His voice is lower when he says your name." Grace breathed that in, then let it out slowly. "I don't want his pity." "Pity spoils," Clotilde said. "Mercy keeps." "What if it doesn't last?" Grace asked, fear small but sharp. "Then we keep lasting," Clotilde said, knotting the thread with a flourish. "We know how to do that." In his study, Edward read a memo Jaden had drafted. Staff liaison elections, emergency fund guidelines, overtime reinstatement, supply chain ethics audit for the corporate kitchens he owned across the state. Each bullet point felt like a plank laid across a river. Bridges aren't pretty when they're new. They're just necessary. He took out a clean card and wrote by hand, his pen scratching the quiet. A note he would hand to Grace later, not to absolve him, but to see her. "I would be honored if you would advise the household on conditions and needs. You will be compensated for your time and expertise. If you decline, I will respect it. If you accept, I will listen." Before he could second-guess, he left the study and went to find her. He met her by the service stairs. She was carrying a tray of folded towels, cotton whiteness stacked like clouds. He stepped aside and let her pass, an almost bow he didn't know his body could perform. "Grace." She paused. He held out the card. She did not make him extend it far. She took it, eyes scanning the handwritten effort. She nodded, and that nod contained continence. "I will think," she said. "Thank you," he answered, meaning it with the whole bend of his back. After she left, he stood on the stair for a long time, listening to the house work around him like a body. He could hear the pulse of the boiler, the breath of the air ducts, the muscles of the staff moving, lifting, tending. He felt, for once, not like a head floating above a body, but like a man invited to be part of it. That afternoon, Grace went into the garden not to eat, but to look. She touched the rosemary, its needle scent rising like memory. In Zimbabwe, she had grown herbs in cracked tires behind the school, cuttings traded for tutoring, medicine brewed for coughs and bad days. She pinched a leaf and rubbed it between her fingers until oil shone, then held that green perfume to her face, like good news. A gardener approached cautiously, unsure of his permissions. "Ms. Grace," he said with a shy nod. "You like rosemary?" "I like what it reminds me of," she said. "Food with a name." He smiled and without words, snipped a handful and wrapped it in damp paper. He handed it to her as if passing a secret from hand to hand. "For your room," he said. She took it and felt the old teacher stir in her, the woman who turned chalk into doors. She wondered if there was a way to grow something here that fed more than the eye. A garden that wasn't performance but pantry. In his office, Edward read the annual report of his foundation, a glossy thing that smelled like ink and good intentions. He saw photos of smiling children in schools he had sponsored overseas. He felt a twist of dissonance. Charity had always been easiest when it stayed far away, obedient in brochures, unmessy in his foyer. But the truest need was under his roof. And mercy without proximity had made him proud, not kind. He picked up the phone and called the foundation director. "We're broadening our mission," he said. "Domestic workers. Education, legal support, housing assistance, food security. I want a program designed with them, not for them." "That's a big pivot," the director said carefully. "It's a right-sized one," he answered. "Start here. In my own house." When he hung up, he realized he was breathing differently, not shallower, not deeper, but truer. Like air had found new rooms in his chest. As evening drew its soft line across the sky, Grace sat at her small desk and took out paper. She wrote to her sister. "My dearest Thandi, there is a garden here, so green it looks like it drank rain from heaven. Yesterday, it turned into a place of shame for me. Today, a spoon and a sentence made it less so. The man of this house is learning to lower his eyes, and perhaps his heart will follow. I do not know if it will last. But I have decided to hold myself like the woman I was before hunger taught me to bow. A teacher. If I stay, it will be to teach again, this time adults who forgot some important words. Tell the children I keep a picture of them near the window, so the light can find their faces again. Pray for me the way you always do, with open hands. Sometimes that is the only way to carry heavy things." She folded the letter and kissed the envelope. She placed it under the rosemary sprig and felt the room smell like courage and soup and classrooms. Downstairs, the house gathered itself for night. Maria drifted through the living room and stopped at the threshold, watching her father write something at his desk. He looked older and younger at once, stripped of a layer that had made him shiny and untouchable. She hovered, unsure whether to apologize or double down. She chose neither and stood perfectly still, letting time do a little work between them. Edward looked up, surprised to see her there, then offered a small smile that reached no further than he could afford. "Want to help me with something?" he asked, and his voice didn't ask for obedience, it invited presence. "What kind of something?" she asked, default defense softening by degrees. "The kind where we listen more than we talk," he said. She nodded once, the delicate beginning of a bridge. On his way to bed, he detoured into the kitchen. The sign above the pantry door, meals, 8 a.m., 12 p.m., 6 p.m., caught the light. Someone had added a second note underneath in a different hand, and snacks for night shift. The exclamation point made him smile in the dark like a man discovering that joy is not a luxury item. He opened the staff refrigerator. Inside, containers labeled neatly, fruit in bowls, a plate covered with plastic wrap, and labeled for Grace, "Do not touch." He closed it gently, as one closes the lid on a box of something living. At the edge of sleep, both he and Grace found themselves walking memories field. She saw a dry riverbed carrying the reflection of a blue sky without water. He saw an alley with a boy and a warm loaf. They walked until their paths, tired of being two, edged toward one, not yet touching but within reach. Roots do their work in the dark. They do not demand witnesses. They simply go down, even when the ground is stingy, searching for a drink that will one day lift a stem into light. That night, in a house too large and a room too small, roots move quietly, through old shame, through new resolve, toward the same underground river. Morning would come, and with it bills and meetings, and that particular look wealth gives to change. But for now, the garden slept, and the earth kept its counsel. And somewhere in the silence, a teacher and a billionaire learned a first shared lesson. The past does not end, it feeds. The house changed its face for parties. It learned a new smile, wide, dazzling, almost blinding. Chandeliers woke from their daytime slumber to scatter light like diamonds across black tuxedos and gold gowns. A small army of florists arranged hydrangeas tall enough to be mistaken for clouds. A pianist rehearsed the kind of jazz that sounds like money remembering it used to be sweat. In the front hall, a banner unfurled with the foundation's logo, a stylized open hand cradling a small house. Underneath, a line in serif type, "Building Futures." In a side room, an event planner drew a final X on a floor plan and nodded at Edward. 700 guests, 3 bars for carving stations, and a live pledge drive between courses. The menu is printed, and the board is prepared to present your new initiative. Congratulations, Mr. Langston. This will be a night to remember. Edward half smiled, an expression that no longer fit his face the way it used to. Let's make sure we remember the right things, he said. He wore a midnight tuxedo but left the bow tie loose, as if some part of him refused to be managed. When he walked to the balcony overlooking the ballroom, he paused. The room swelled with the pre-gala murmur, 1,000 small ambitions warming their vocal cords. Donors air kissed air. Photographers fox-stepped through clusters of laughter, hunting the angle that turned philanthropy into spectacle. Maria floated among them in a dress the color of champagne and the expression of someone determined not to sip. Jaden appeared at Edward's shoulder, adjusting a cufflink with fingers that were never idle. Cameras will want 20 seconds of your soul during the speech, he said, almost smiling. Offer them 25. Is that your professional recommendation? My personal one, Jaden said. His eyes flicked over the room, then down toward the service corridor, where a thin line of staff moved like a river no one upstairs believed in. How are your nerves? Hungry, Edward said, before he realized how precisely the word fit. Do we have everything ready for the announcement? Jaden nodded. The foundation pivot is set. Domestic workers' protections, scholarships for their children, legal aid, a pantry network seated here. The board will clap in rhythm. And their hearts? Edward asked. Jaden's smile cooled into candor. Some will change later than others. But change has a sound. Tonight you make it loud. Downstairs, below elegance, beyond the angle of cameras, heat gathered. The kitchen throbbed with the labor of abundance. Trays of painted desserts marched to chillers. Silver platters gleamed like moons. In the far corner, Grace folded napkins into lilies with the quiet authority of a teacher aligning a chalk line. A rosemary sprig, gifted by the gardener, dried above her locker like a small green promise. Nurse Clotilde ladled soup into tasting bowls for the servers. Eat, she commanded in a tone that blessed and brooked no argument. A long night eats you back if you don't. Grace lifted a spoon. The flavor was clean, leek, potato, something gentle. She let it linger on her tongue, not rushing, punctuating motion with nourishment as she had learned to do when the world was stingy. Are you well? Clotilde asked, eyes narrowing with the attention that sees beneath faces. I am steady, Grace said. Some days steady is enough. Clotilde touched her wrist. Steady holds bridges. On a clipboard by the door, Trevor ticked through assignments, voice brisk. Tray rotation A, B, C. Champagne to the east wing. Atlantic oysters, watch the shells. Hot plates out in 5. Grace, you're on plating for the 3rd course, then relief on the coffee line. And, he dropped his voice a degree as Edward entered the kitchen. Eyes up. He's here. The room's tempo shifted when Edward stepped inside, not a feigned deference, but the wary recalibration of people measuring whether yesterday's promise would survive tonight's performance. He felt it like a temperature drop, and didn't blame them for it. He had spent years training this house to flinch. He met Grace's gaze. Good evening, Mrs. Ndlovu. Good evening, Mr. Langston, she replied, the corners of her mouth finding a middle ground between reserve and recognition. Thank you for everything you do, he said, the words imperfect but honest. He held them out without expecting them to cover anything except themselves. Clotilde watched from a distance, arms folded. When Edward turned to leave, she stopped him with a look that older sisters save for younger brothers who think they're men. You will eat before you speak, she asked. I will, he said. Something real, she pressed. He glanced at the trays of canapes marching toward the elevator in neat ranks. Something real, he confirmed, and surprised himself by meaning stew, bread, the kind of food that respects hunger's honesty. Upstairs, the gala poured into itself. Maria shone in the foyer, her smile rehearsed and newly fragile around the edges. A woman whose earrings could pay a small hospital bill whispered, your father's new initiative, very on trend. Domestic workers. Who knew? Maria laughed, which felt like glass again, and moved on before the echo could draw blood. She found Jaden by the silent auction, where bidders wrote numbers that could have been mercy, but more often were theater. You're the conscience, right? She said to him, teasing layered over curiosity. I'm the calculator, he said mildly. But sometimes arithmetic reveals God. She raised an eyebrow. Bold for a man in a suit. "Truth wears many fabrics," he said, and Maria let herself smile because the line was corny the way courage sometimes is. The pianist rolled into a Gershwin that suggested cities where nights never end. Waiters wove like needlework through the room, stitching glasses back to brims. Edward met board members, accepted compliments shaped like congratulations for a battle not yet fought. He kept looking toward the wings, the place where staff slipped between worlds, like a man who had misplaced something priceless and was not sure if it wanted to be found. When the first course lifted, the kitchen became choreography. Hands, steam, voices, the bark of timing. Grace stood at the plating station, turning salads into small artworks. As she set radishes like blush on porcelain, memory brushed her shoulder. Thin children clustered around a table that trembled when they laughed, the way a single mango sliced into slivers could taste like a feast if shared with ceremony. She blinked and returned to the plate in front of her. Ceremony mattered here, too. Every place deserved dignity. By the second course, the embodiment of upstairs and downstairs exposed its theater. At the edge of the service hall, a young server with tense shoulders stood, tray balanced, eyes on the unobstructed opulence. He whispered to Grace as she passed, "I didn't know there were that many forks." "There are more kinds of hunger than forks," she murmured back, not unkind. He straightened. "You talk like my grandmother." "I am someone's," she said, and her smile warmed the remark into belonging. Midway through the evening, the moment arrived. The MC tugged the spotlight gently to center stage and announced the man of the hour. Applause rose like foam. Edward walked to the podium, breath measured, chin lowered, not in defeat, but in intention. The light found the furrows time had cut into his face, and for once they read less like status and more like story. "Thank you for being here," he began, voice calm, carrying without strain. "Tonight we gather for a cause we've long believed in, building futures for families who need a hand up. But I come to you a different man than the one who planned this gala." Polite laughter tried to land and failed to find its mark. He continued, "In the last week, I learned something about my house. I learned that we can be generous in public and ungenerous in private, that the story we tell about our goodness can outrun the truth we avoid about our habits. I learned," he paused, letting the sentence breathe, "that under my own roof, people went hungry because I put savings above care." Sound in the room rearranged itself. Glasses paused. A cough canceled itself. Maria pressed her palms together as if holding something fragile that wanted to fly. "I could tidy this for you," Edward said. "I could say a manager forgot or a policy was misapplied. But the simple truth is I built a machine that rewarded blindness. So tonight, when I ask for your support, I'm not asking you to praise what we've done. I'm asking you to help us do what we should have been doing all along, beginning with the people who make our lives function." He signaled, and on the screens behind him appeared pictures not of faceless beneficiaries in far countries, but of hands in his own house. Hands ironing sleeves, hands washing glasses until they shone, hands wiping a child's spill with patience that had no camera. Our foundation will focus on domestic workers, their rights, their education, their families. We will fund legal support for abuses too common to name and too old to tolerate. We will build community kitchens where staff eat first. And we will design it with them, not for them. In the kitchen, the sound arrived as a muffled wave. Grace paused, a plate in her left hand, a pair of tongs in her right. She closed her eyes and let the words enter the space where skepticism and hope had been negotiating rent. Applause began uncertainly, then found its hands. It wasn't the standing ovation of a triumphant keynote. It was the first clap of people who felt the risk and liked it more than the safety of applause for applause's sake. Jaden watched the room, who hesitated, who leaned forward, making a quiet ledger that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with future conversations. Back downstairs, the rush resumed. The third course had to fly. A junior cook cried silently over a broken hollandaise, and Clotilde slipped beside him, whisking patience into eggs until they agreed to be sauce again. Grace moved to coffee service, where the line of cups glowed like a small choir. She had been on her feet for hours, not a rare thing, but tonight the weight in her calves felt like a long story ache. She drank water. She ate half a roll between runs, the rosemary in her pocket sending up courage, like incense. The air thickened around the espresso machine. Steam, sugar, 1,000 orders taking turns to be important. Then the room tilted a degree. It was a small tilt, the kind that asks if you slept enough and answers for you when you haven't. Grace steadied herself against the counter, waited for the blood to choose a position, and continued. She delivered demitasse to the elevator, smiled at a waiter with a tray wider than his lungs, and returned to the machine. Another tilt. A breath. She looked for a chair and found none. The music upstairs swelled into a brass flourish she could feel in her bones. Grace. Clotilde's voice threaded through the steam. I am all right, Grace began, and the sentence broke in the middle. Its two have searching for each other like hands in a dark room. Clotilde was already there, a chair appearing out of nowhere, a glass of water arriving with the speed of someone who has practiced rescue their entire life. Sit, she said, and the command was a blessing. Grace sat. The world negotiated its terms. The tilt reduced itself to a suggestion. Her hand shook, a small earthquake, leaving fine cracks. She breathed in the rosemary. The scent climbed into her head and built a scaffold for the light to hold on to. Trevor materialized, concern and calculation racing each other across his face. Do we need to call? No, Grace said, steadying. I need air. Clotilde nodded. The back door. Slowly. They moved together through the corridor, past boxes of wine, past lists taped to walls, past a poster of hand-washing steps that felt like a ritual for purifying uncounted days. The door opened onto the night like forgiveness. The air was cooler back here, the music turned soft by brick and distance. The garden stretched beyond, its artfulness blurring into shadow. Grace stood in the threshold and closed her eyes, letting the breeze lay its hand on her forehead. The rosemary scent mingled with damp earth. Tears came, not dramatic, not cinematic, just two fine lines that understood gravity. She didn't wipe them away. They were honest, and honesty did not require hiding. Do you want me to? Clotilde began. Stay, Grace said, and they did, two women sharing a small square of night. Inside, the program flowed on, pledges announced, checks raised like white flags surrendering to a better war. Maria watched her father end his speech without the old triumphant pose, his shoulders carrying both the weight and the willingness. Guests approached with well-meaning words. Some were sincere. Some were rehearsals for their next dinner. She saw the difference tonight for the first time. She slipped away, needing air of her own, and took a wrong turn that turned right. The service corridor loomed, fluorescence, metal, the hum of work. She moved by instinct rather than map and found the back door open to the garden, where two figures stood like punctuation at the edge of a sentence, Clotilde, solid as a comma holding meaning in place, and Grace, leaning, recovering, a semicolon refusing to end the line. Grace, Maria said, then stopped, hearing the intimacy in the name on her tongue, as if it belonged there all along. Grace turned, not embarrassed, just human. Ms. Langston. Are you okay? Maria asked, unsteady on new ground. I am, Grace said. Just needed the sky. Maria stepped closer, then stopped, conscious for once of the shoes she wore, and the floors they expected. Do you need anything? Clotilde studied the young woman's face and found sincerity waiting, a fledgling, thin-feathered but determined. A chair, she said, testing. Maria disappeared and returned with one wooden good not folding, the kind of detail that reveals whether care is convenient or considered. She set it down. Grace sat. Maria stood, hands useless for the first time in memory, and let them be useless rather than pretend otherwise. Thank you, Grace said. Of course, Maria replied, words trembling toward a larger vocabulary. I heard my father's speech. It was different. It was a beginning, Grace said. Beginnings are small on purpose, so we don't trip. Back inside, a burst of applause swelled, cueing the dessert parade. Trevor, reading the room like a conductor, collected himself and returned to his orchestra. The kitchen resumed its relentless kindness. Someone tucked a plate of warm custard into a quiet corner with a note that read for later, Grace. Edward, finished with the flattery portion of his penance, excused himself and took the long way to the kitchen. He needed to see the back of the tapestry again, to remind himself where the real picture was woven. He found the service corridor emptying and filling at once a tide. Have you seen Grace? He asked a passing waiter. Outside, the waiter said, jerking his chin toward the open door. Edward stepped into the night and stopped at the sight. Grace seated, Clotilde beside her, Maria standing with her hand on the chair like a guard who had finally memorized the right gate. The three of them made a shape he'd never seen under his roof, a little architecture built of care, not hierarchy. Grace, he said, the hush in his voice unplanned. She looked up, no apology in her eyes. "I just needed the sky," she repeated, and he heard the sentence this time as instruction, not explanation. "You have it," he said. "Take what you need." She nodded and stood slowly, testing the floor with caution and victory. "I can return to service." "You can return when you wish," he said, then turned to Maria. "Thank you." She shrugged, awkward suddenly, in her own house. "It's just a chair." "It isn't," he said. They stood together a moment, the four of them listening to the gala's voice through the walls. Somewhere, a donor pledged a number. Somewhere else, a dishwasher laughed at a joke only exhaustion understands. Above them, the stars arranged themselves with their usual brevity. "Mr. Langston," Clotilde said finally, not gently and not harshly, just true. "You spoke well." "I intended to speak honestly," he answered. "Honesty is the language people trust after being lied to," she said. "Keep speaking it. But remember, tonight is the easy part. Tomorrow is the work." "I know," he said, feeling the weight land in his hands rather than on his back. They returned inside, the kitchen pulling them back into its orbit. Grace took the coffee line again, but with a chair nearby, a compromise between body and duty. Maria hovered, taking plates from a counter to a server without drama, discovering that movement can be apology when words are late. When the night finally exhaled and guests drifted out in perfume and praise, the house dropped its shoulders. The pianist closed the lid. The chandeliers quieted. Staff stacked chairs in rows that looked almost like pews after service. In the pantry, someone taped another note under the meal schedule, "Leftover trays, please take home." The handwriting was Edward's, and the exclamation point was slightly crooked, as if enthusiasm had startled the pen. Grace found the plate of custard with her name on it. She ate it at the edge of the stainless table, spoon slow, head bowed not in shame, but in gratitude older than language. Edward stood in the doorway and did not interrupt the sacrament. When she finished, she placed the spoon carefully on the plate and looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the custard?" he asked. "For trying," she said. "Trying is not nothing." He nodded. "Tomorrow," he said, and the word was both a promise and a door. "Tomorrow," she echoed. In the quiet after the quiet, the house listened to itself breathe. Upstairs, the banner that promised building futures sagged a little at one corner, a perfect imperfection. Downstairs, a rosemary sprig perfumed a locker and a woman's resolve. In the garden, the grass recovered where it had been pressed, insisting on a small, insistent green. And somewhere inside the man who owned it all, a different hunger woke and stretched, one that did not devour but offered, asking to be fed with choices that cost exactly what they were worth. Morning found the mansion in a soft hangover, the kind that follows celebration when the guests are gone, and the house hears its own footsteps again. Balloon ribbons slept on the carpet like tired snakes. The chandelier's crystals had the dull look of jewels after a long night. In the kitchen, the industrial dishwasher chugged like a ferry running late. The gala's music had been packed away, but the echoes stayed, folding into corners, waiting to be noticed. Edward walked through the foyer without his tie, jacket slung over his arm. He stopped beneath the balcony where last night he had tested honesty on his tongue and found it edible. His reflection rose in the high-gloss floor, a man too used to ceilings telling him how big to dream. This morning, the ceiling felt less like a permission slip and more like a reminder that there was sky outside the roof's reach. He turned toward the staff wing. Voices drifted up, a low hum of jokes too gentle to bruise, the clack of dish bins, the shush of a broom like wind across tall grass. He paused in the doorway of the pantry. On the bulletin board, the meal schedule remained, but now small notes bloomed around it. Vegetarian option? Night shift fruit, please. Thanks for the bread. He felt a quiet pride that didn't demand applause. Grace stood at the counter inspecting a box of produce delivered at sunrise, spinach still damp, tomatoes blushing, a loaf of bread that snapped when pressed. The rosemary sprig on her locker had dried into a small green fossil. She lifted a tomato to her nose and inhaled. The scent was Summer's handwriting. "Good morning," Edward said, careful to fit his voice into the room without pushing air away. Grace glanced up. "Good morning, Mr. Langston." A faint smile, then back to the work of choosing what would nourish. He waited, not to be served but to be taught by the quiet. "How did last night land?" he asked finally. "It landed," Grace said, an answer that held both weight and caution. "A landing is not the same as a home." "I know," he said. "I'm learning the difference." Clotilde appeared with a clipboard, spectacles perched at the tip of her nose, like a judge about to rule on common sense. "We need 2 more hot plates for night shift," she announced. "And the leak in the hallway that drips into the laundry room bucket is starting to sound like an old man's cough. Fix it before it becomes pneumonia." "Consider it done," Edward said, taking out his phone to text maintenance. He stopped and lowered the device. "Actually, show me." He followed her through the corridor. The leak, a small silver ton of water, fell with persistence. He listened. It did sound like a cough trapped in the wall. He called the building manager. "Today," he said. The man on the other end began to explain schedules. "Today," Edward repeated, and something in his tone pulled "today" into the man's calendar. On his way back, he found Maria in the East Hall, staring at a painting she'd passed 1,000 times and never seen. A woman in a white dress stood beside a river that was too blue to be true. Maria's hair was tied back in a quick knot. Last night's glamour had been rinsed away, leaving a face unarmed. "Morning," Edward ventured. She glanced at him, then back at the painting. "Do you ever feel like the house is listening?" He tilted his head. "To what?" "To us," she said. "To how we live inside it." He looked up at the vaulted ceiling. The air carried the scent of floor polish and new fruit. "I hope so," he said. "I've given a lot to listen to. Not all of it worth hearing." She crossed her arms, bracing against a draft only she felt. "People texted me after your speech," she said. "Some said it was brave. Some said it was reckless. One woman said you were making poverty chic." "And what do you think?" he asked. She lifted one shoulder. "I think I've never seen you say I was wrong into a microphone." "That's because I've avoided microphones when I was wrong," he said. "That strategy stopped working." Maria's gaze traveled down the hall toward the service door. "I found Grace outside last night," she said, voice softer. "She needed a chair. I got her one." "I know," he said. "Thank you." Her chin dipped in a nod, a concession to an alliance not yet named. "Will this be a phase?" she asked. "Or a life?" He thought of the leak, the notes on the board, the Rosemary's insistence, the taste of stew. "A life," he said. Maria breathed out. "That's bigger than a speech." "I'm aware." He hesitated. "Help me make it not just mine. Make it ours." She glanced at him, surprise briefly wiping away her practiced indifference. "What does help look like?" "Start with yourself," he said. "Learn names. Ask what we've been missing because our rooms were too big to hear small voices." He pointed at the painting. "Begin with listening." Her mouth twitched, the early sprout of a smile. "You're quoting Clotilde." "I am plagiarizing wisdom," he admitted. "It suits me." Later that morning, Edward drove to his downtown headquarters, Langston Holdings, a glass tooth biting into the sky. The lobby's stone floor threw up a polished version of every passerby. Receptionists smiled, like good lighting incarnate. He rode the elevator with executives perfumed in confidence and a trace of fear they hid behind jargon. In the boardroom, the view did its usual trick, the city arranged like a model train set, the river obedient, the traffic quiet as veins under glass. His board assembled, men whose watches cost more than the leak repair and women who had trained themselves to be colder than the room's air to be heard at all. "Congratulations on the gala," a board member said. "Press is mostly positive. 1 or 2 blogs called it performative, but you know the internet." "Performative is when you stop at the performance," Edward said. "We won't." He clicked a remote. The screen behind him showed numbers, the company's wage structure, overtime policy, vendor contracts, the cost savings from automation that had once made him feel clever. He felt none of that now, only an impatience to stop talking and start doing. "We are underpaying the people who keep this building standing," he began. "Our contracted cleaning crews have no sick leave. Our cafeteria workers eat on breaks they're too short to digest. We are efficient at cost and negligent at care. That changes today." A cough, a shifting of suits. "Edward," a board member began, the tone of a man who had rehearsed a gentle intervention, "you are responding to a public moment with a structural overcorrection. We have obligations to shareholders." "Our primary obligation is to do no harm," Edward said, quieter. "And then to do good. I have ignored the first long enough." Jaden sat at the far end of the table, a quiet ally. "We've run the numbers," he said, sliding packets across the mahogany. "Raising baseline wages, adding benefits to contracted staff, creating an internal ombuds program, and instituting a vendor code of ethics. Short-term margin impact is measurable. Long-term return is cultural stability, retention, brand trust, and the part you can't put on a graph. We get to like who we are. A woman with steel gray hair leaned forward. Who leads the Ombuds program? Someone people trust, Jaden said. Chosen by the people who need them, not appointed by the people who want to control them. We'll be outliers, another board member warned. Edward nodded. Then let us be outliers in the right direction. There were objections, calibrations, misgivings. He listened without letting the room steal the center of gravity. By the end of 2 hours, the board had voted, not unanimous, but decisive. A new internal architecture would be built. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt aligned, like a bone set after a long time crooked. He returned to the mansion early afternoon, an impulse he didn't argue with. The house welcomed him with ordinary sounds, vacuum, soft radio from a portable speaker, someone humming something that made even dust sound like a dance partner. In the kitchen, a pot simmered, beans with tomato and garlic. The smell made his stomach feel honest. He found Grace at a small table with a stack of papers and a pen. "What are you working on?" he asked. She looked up. "A list," she said, "of what the house needs if it wants to be kind." "May I see?" She slid the top page to him. In neat handwriting, she'd written, "Breaks with real chairs. Replace the laundry detergent with the hypoallergenic kind. Rita gets rashes. Fix hallway leak. Staff library, English classes, immigration resources. Garden plot for herbs and greens. Shoes stipend for those who stand all day. Quiet room for prayer or breath." He felt his throat go tight at the word breath. "This is good," he said. "This is a constitution." She smiled. "A house cannot be kind by accident. It must learn manners. Will you teach it?" "If you will be a student," she said. He laughed softly. "I will be the kind who takes notes." Maria walked in carrying a box. "Donations from the gala leftovers," she said, setting it on the counter. "Linens, a few centerpieces. I thought the community center we support could use them." She caught herself. "I mean, the one we will build." Grace's eyebrows lifted. "You will build?" "I suppose we will," Maria said, tasting the pronoun like a new spice. Clotilde entered with a basket of laundry and listened from the doorway, her smile invisible but not absent. "If we're building," she said, "start with a place for mothers to sit where no one asks them to move." "Done," Edward said, taking out his notebook. He wrote, seating that respects fatigue. They spent an hour there, Grace drafting, Maria searching for local partners on her tablet, Edward calling the foundation director to approve grants that would outlive the afterglow of last night. The kitchen became a war room where the only battle was against indifference. The room felt like a chest breathing deeper than before. Later, Grace stepped into the garden with a small shovel and a packet of seeds bought from a corner store with mislabeled shelves. The gardener, Miguel, met her at the edge of the lawn, cap in hand. "You want a plot?" he asked, hopeful. "If there's a corner the eyes do not visit, perhaps," she said. He led her to a rectangle near the service path, where the grass had given up. "This spot fails to impress the magazine," he said, grinning. "It could feed someone instead." They knelt. Soil gave way easily, like a conversation that had waited too long to be had. Grace pressed seeds into dirt with the tenderness of someone tucking children into bed. Miguel watered, the stream making a dark ribbon through light earth. "What is it?" he asked. "Spinach," she said. "It grows like a stubborn prayer." Edward appeared at the edge of the plot, hands in pockets, a student arriving at class. "May I?" Grace nodded to a trowel. He crouched and dug a shallow furrow. His hands were clean in the way offices require. They would not stay that way. He slid seeds into the small trench. The motion felt like signing a contract with a quieter partner. Maria joined them, bewildered into smiling at the tableau they made, Billionaire, Maid, gardener kneeling in the dirt. "If the board could see you," she teased her father. "I hope they do," he said. "Eventually, on their knees too." The afternoon draped itself over the house like a softer coat. In the staff corridor, the leak went silent. A maintenance man replaced the bucket with a patch and left behind only the faint memory of a cough that had resolved. In the laundry, new detergent sat like a promise. On the bulletin board, Maria tacked a flyer. English class sign-up, Saturdays, taught by Ms. Ndlovu, if she agrees. Grace raised an eyebrow at the presumption and then checked the box next to yes. Evening eased in. Edward sat on the back steps, sleeves rolled, watching the garden trade its greens for blues. Jaden arrived, jacket off, tie loosened, the look of a man who had carried boxes of numbers all day and finally set them down. "How did the board take it?" Edward asked. "They grumbled in G," Jaden said, "but they signed in C major." Edward chuckled. "You always did explain money, like music." "It's all ratios and harmony," Jaden said, sitting. He scanned the yard and whistled softly. "You planted something." "Spinach," Edward said, "and the idea that a lawn can be a pantry." "That's a radical sentence for a man who once measured lawns in prestige," Jaden said, smiling. Edward grew serious. "I keep hearing echoes." "Of what?" "Of everyone I didn't hear before," he said. "The mansion used to echo my voice back to me. Now it returns others." "That means you finally stopped insisting on the solo," Jaden said. "We're learning the chorus." Edward considered the word, chorus, and felt it land where it needed to. "Stay for dinner," he said, "with the staff." "Thought you'd never ask," Jaden replied, which was a kindness disguised as wit. In the dining nook near the staff kitchen, they ate stew with rice, and a salad that used the new tomatoes. People talked across tables, without checking if they were allowed to sound like themselves. Maria sat between Clotilde and a housekeeper named Rita, asking about the rash and writing down the name of a clinic that could help. Edward listened more than he spoke. He learned Dev loved old Bollywood soundtracks and had a daughter obsessed with rainbows. He learned Miguel sent money to a cousin saving for mechanic school. He learned the name of the dishwasher whose quiet had fooled him into thinking he had nothing to say. Grace watched the room and felt something like a piano tuning itself, strings tightening, hammers finding the right pressure. She saw Maria passing bread without performing it, Jaden laughing without calculating it, Edward absorbing without arranging it to flatter him. She stood and moved to the small whiteboard stuck to the wall with a magnet. At the top she wrote, "Garden of Hands, ideas people called out." She wrote, "Meal train for anyone sick." "Microloans for staff emergencies." "Childcare during evening shifts." "Shoe swap, gently use, clean." "Legal clinic twice a month." "Wall of photographs, names, and stories." "Stories?" Dev asked, surprised. "Stories," Grace said. "No one vanishes if their story is pinned to a wall." Edward added, "And we'll put one in the main hall, too." Silence rustled. Could such a thing enter the pretty parts of the house? Maria broke it. "Yes," she said. "Let the guests see the hands that hold their glasses." After dinner, Edward walked the mansion alone. He passed the grand piano, its lid closed like a lowered voice. He lifted it, pressed one key softly. The note lifted and floated into the high ceiling. The echo returned, but this time it brought something with it. The faint thread of laughter from the kitchen, the clink of bowls, Grace's chalk-still handwriting on a whiteboard, the whisper of seeds taking root in new ground. The mansion didn't just send his sound back. It carried others forward. He paused at the portrait gallery, ancestors in oil, stern and certain. For the first time he wondered about the staff who had dusted those frames 100 years ago, their names unwritten, but their fingerprints everywhere. He touched the gilded edge of one frame and whispered, "I see you," to a past that couldn't hear but maybe, in the way houses keep memory, could be comforted anyway. When he reached his study, Maria was there, curled in an old leather chair with her knees tucked in. A book lay open in her lap. She looked up. "I signed up to volunteer at the community center," she said without preamble. "Clotilde says they need someone to organize donations and not make a mess of it." "Clotilde would know," he said. "I'm proud of you." She grimaced. "Please don't turn it into a certificate." "Then I'm grateful," he said. "For you." She nodded, accepting the currency. A beat. "Dad," she added, hesitating, "I'm sorry for the way I spoke about Grace. About all of them." "I didn't." She searched for a truth that didn't let her off. "I didn't want to know. It made my world easier." "Mine too," he said. "Ignorance made me comfortable and cruel. We can both stop paying that price." She closed the book. "Will you teach me how to hear the echoes?" He considered. "No," he said gently. "They'll teach us." The night deepened. In the servants' corridor, someone pinned a new photograph to a wall. A schoolroom in Zimbabwe, children with chalk-dusted fingers. Grace stood before a long time. She wrote beneath it in her neat hand, "Before I cleaned this house, I built one." In the garden, the freshly disturbed soil lay dark, a quiet promise stitched just beneath the skin of the earth. If one stood very still, one could almost hear the seeds whispering to each other about the work ahead. Upstairs, Edward sat at his desk and drafted a letter to the households in his network, the ones who called him for advice on investments and art. He wrote about salaries, kitchens, bathrooms without leaks, names learned and used, the cost of dinners that taste better when everyone who cooked them ate first. He did not ask for praise. He asked for courage, and he offered his phone number without an assistance filter. He ended the letter with a sentence that surprised him by arriving whole. If your house doesn't echo with the lives of those who keep it standing, then it echoes with your own voice too loudly. He signed his name. He sealed envelopes. He switched off the lamp. As he left the study, the room seemed to nod, wood and leather accepting a new agreement. The mansion settled into sleep. Its echoes, once a chorus of his importance, now carried other timbers: Grace's steady alto, Clotilde's unflinching contralto, Maria's tentative soprano finding pitch, Jaden's clear tenor, the hum of the staff finally fed, and therefore willing to sing. The house did not change its walls overnight. But walls acquire character from what they contain, and tonight they contained something like a beginning that intended to stay. In her small room, Grace lay awake and listened to the hush. It was not empty. It was full of footsteps going the right direction. She closed her eyes and saw seeds, chalk, a chair in a doorway, under a sky. She whispered a prayer with no words, only gratitude, which is the oldest language of endurance. Somewhere in the quiet, a new echo started. The sound a heart makes when it recognizes its work and is no longer afraid to do it. Dawn arrived like a careful hand smoothing the creases from the night. The mansion yawned softly, pipes clearing their throats, the boiler settling into its hum, a distant vacuum stitching lines into a hallway rug. In the staff kitchen, someone left a plate of cut fruit under plastic wrap, a small constellation of color waiting for the first hungry soul to lift the cover. On the bulletin board, a new note appeared in neat handwriting. English class sign-up, Saturday for p.m. Beneath it, a row of names began to bloom. Grace woke before her alarm. Sleep had visited but refused to stay, like a polite neighbor who knows she is needed somewhere else. She sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the floor with her feet, as if the ground might have shuffled in the night. The rosemary sprig on her windowsill had dried fully. When she rubbed it between her fingers, it still released a ghost of green. She breathed it in and let her chest unclench by degrees. The house had changed its language. Meals were scheduled. Leaks confessed and were forgiven. Names were spoken as if each contained a world, which of course they did. Gratitude grew in her like a warm light, but beside it grew something she did not recognize at first, a shadow not of suspicion but of calling. It was the old teacher in her, tapping the chalk against the board, asking the room to be quiet enough to learn. Only now the room was a city, and the chalk was her life. She opened the drawer where she kept letters. Some were from home, Fandy's careful script delivering news like bread. Some were notes from church ladies addressed to Sister Grace, folded in a way that made even paper feel like a hug. She placed a blank page on top and smoothed it with her palm. The pen warmed between her fingers. Before she wrote, she walked. Past the pantry, fruit, bread, a jar labeled for night shift. Past the laundry, new detergent, the scent of mercy in a bottle. Past the service door into the garden, where the small rectangle of soil she had planted with Miguel had darkened with water. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the dirt. Moisture reached back. Seeds slept with intent. The sun lifted its face above the roofline and put gold on the edges of leaves like a blessing spread thin but sure. "Good morning," Miguel called from the path, cap in hand. "Good morning," she returned. "They are listening." "The seeds?" he asked. "And the people," she said. He grinned. "Both need time and someone to pull the weeds." She stood, brushed her knees, and returned inside, carrying the garden's calm in with her. At the small desk, she began to write. The words did not arrive as soldiers. They arrived as water, finding the lowest relief. "Mr. Langston, I write this before the house wakes fully and before courage has time to argue with love. Thank you for what you have done, the meals, the repairs, the listening with your head bowed. It has been like rain after a long season of dust. There is something I must tell you that I do not know how to say with my mouth yet, so I will give it to the page first. I am going to step away from this house for a time. I have not decided for how long. Please forgive the lack of calendar. Hunger taught me that some decisions are not made in side clocks. Before you think it is because I am ungrateful, know this. I am grateful the way hands are grateful to water. You have turned toward us and given back names that were almost lost. But there is a call that has been knocking on my ribs since before I came to your garden. Is the old classroom inside me. When I watched the board in the kitchen last night and saw the word stories, I felt the chalk again in my hand. When I stood in the garden with seeds, I remembered the children in Zimbabwe whose mouths shaped English like a new song, and how a mango shared in slices could feel like a diploma when eaten slowly. The world is wider than this house, and there are women whose kitchens have no board to post meals on, whose names are known only to the hunger that calls them. I have worked with them. At the shelter on 83rd Cornerstone House, I used to stand in line for a bag of groceries when the pantry here closed. There are girls there who clean offices at night and hold their breath when men with key cards pass. There are aunties with papers that confuse them, and grandmothers who can make soup from bones and air but have no table to sit at while it cooks. They need English. They need letters written to landlords who speak in fines. They need someone to look at their hands and say, "I see the work you have done. You have started a good thing here." But if I stay, I will keep polishing the same surface and forget the rooms with no polish at all. That would be an easy love. I am trying to choose the harder love. Do not think you have driven me away. Your change has given me permission to believe change is possible elsewhere. A student who learns in a kind classroom is not unfaithful when she graduates. She carries the classroom forward. I will leave my keys with Clotilde. I have folded the linens and taught Dev a new way to stack plates so the light catches them friendly. I have written a list of suppliers who will not cheat you on fruit and will throw in an extra melon when they can. Is taped inside the pantry door. There is stew in the fridge for night shift and a note on it that says, "For us." You do not owe me anything for stepping away. If you wish to pay me for my last week, send it to Cornerstone House with a note that says, "For the women who teach me." If you wish to speak to me, you know where to find me, but know also that if I am stirring a pot or sounding out vowels with someone who needs patient letters, I will ask you to wait the way hunger waits to be fed in the right order. Thank you for seeing me. It made a hole in my shame and let light through. Please do not carry guilt like a trophy. Carry it like a tool. It is for building what should have been built, not for looking at in the mirror. If the garden grows, send me a picture. If the house forgets, read this again. With respect, Grace and Lovu, she set the pen down and read the letter aloud, quiet enough not to wake the sleeping air. Each sentence felt like a step taken carefully on new ground. She folded the page, slid it into an envelope, and wrote his name on the front with the neatness of a teacher grading a paper she respects. She dressed in her uniform for the last time for a while, smoothing the fabric as if telling it thank you. She tidied her room to the kind of clean that makes absence feel less like an emptiness and more like a pause. She placed the rosemary in a small jar with water, as if to say the plant and the woman both could soften if given what they needed. By 7, the kitchen stirred. Clotilde entered like morning news, with a face that told time more reliably than any clock. She watched Grace seal the envelope. "You are telling him?" Clotilde asked, already knowing. "I am telling the house," Grace said. "Through him." Clotilde took her hand and pressed it between her palms. "Go with the blessing you refused to ask for," she said. "It is yours anyway." "I will come back," Grace said. "I know," Clotilde answered. "Even if you don't come back to this building, you will come back to us in what you build." Dev peeked around the corner, hair damp from a rushed wash. "Miss Grace? Is today the class?" "Saturday," she corrected. "But today I will teach you the good stacking." He grinned, 20 years old and hungry for anything that counted as skill. They spent 20 minutes setting plates in a way that made space appear where there had been none. "Always leave room for one more," she said, "in dishes and in heart." When Edward arrived late morning from a meeting he had half slept through, he found the house holding a note for him everywhere he looked, a cleaner floor than usual, a line of cups aligned so precisely it resembled care, the first tips of green in a garden bed that had been only in tension yesterday. He felt something he hadn't in years, a fear that wasn't about losing money, but about losing a chance to do the right thing at the right time. He saw the envelope on his desk. His name looked smaller in Grace's hand, and somehow more correct. He sat, slid a finger under the flap, and unfolded the letter. He read it once too quickly, like a man who has trained himself to devour information and move it to the next column. Then he read it again, slowly, allowing each line to press its weight into him. He reached the sentence about the shelter and felt the map of his city redraw itself. He reached the sentence about guilt and recognized the old habit of polishing shame until it shone, a useless trophy, indeed. He reached the line about the garden, and understood that growth was a language he could learn only by letting things take their time. He stood, letter in hand, and searched for Clotilde. He found her in the hallway, stitching a button back onto a uniform with thread that matched the original color by instinct. "She's gone," he said, the word not accusation but weather. "For now," Clotilde said. He let a breath out, and realized he had been holding it. "Is she safe?" "She is with her work," Clotilde replied. "That is safety as true as Lux." He nodded, absorbing the new logic. "Cornerstone House." 83rd, she confirmed. He hesitated the way a man hesitates before entering a church for the first time, not because he lacks faith, but because he lacks practice. "Will it be an intrusion if I go?" "It will be an intrusion if you think you own the room," Clotilde said, kindness drilling straight through to truth. "If you go as a student, the door will not notice your shoes." He smiled despite the ache. "Then I will go in socks if I have to." He stopped by the kitchen. Maria was there, a scarf tied around her hair, sleeves rolled, placing labels on pantry bins with serious concentration. "Pasta, rice, beans," she wrote, then added smile to the corner as if to remind the containers what faces were for. "She left a letter," he said. "I know," Maria replied, glancing up. "She told me in a way that was not asking permission." He showed her the page. She read the line about graduates and classrooms and surprised herself by tearing up. "I thought I wanted her to stay," she said, "but that was selfish. I wanted to be near goodness without doing the work of becoming it." "We can do both," he said. "Be near and become." She put the cap back on the marker. "Let's go see her." Not to pull her back. To help push. They left the house. No convoy, no announcement. Jaden met them at the curb, sensing in that way he had that the day had chosen a new subject. "Cornerstone House?" he asked, already tapping his phone for directions. The shelter sat on a block the city often pretended it didn't own. A mural of hands planting a tree climbed one brick wall, chipped but beautiful. The door opened and let out the smell of coffee, laundry, and stories. Inside, a small crowd moved around tables with baskets of produce and a sign-in sheet that welcomed names in many scripts. A baby slept in a wrap on a mother's chest, the rise and fall like a quiet wave. A bulletin board announced ESL classes, tenant rights workshops, a food co-op meeting. Someone had written, "We belong," in chalk above a water cooler. Grace stood at a folding table with a stack of flashcards, sounding out consonants with two women who were laughing at their own mouths in the way people do when they are brave. "Pooh, but tuh," Grace said, her hand tapping the rhythm, her voice a metronome of patience. The women repeated, and the room briefly felt like a little nation where courage had voting rights. Edward stopped a few steps away, unsure how to insert himself without displacing what mattered. He waited, holding his own importance on a leash. When Grace looked up and saw them, her face did not change much, but something in her shoulders softened. Recognition without fear. Welcome without ceremony. "You found the right door," she said. "We followed your letter," he answered, holding it as if it could guide him across more than one threshold. She turned to her students. "We will pause," she said gently. "Practice the sounds with each other. Remember, lips are instruments." The women grinned and complied. Grace stepped closer to Edward, Maria, and Jaden. "You came to visit?" she asked. "We came to listen," Edward said. "Good," she replied, and motioned to a volunteer table. "We need hands to sort onions from oranges. People keep mixing them like they are cousins." Maria laughed and rolled up her sleeves higher. Jaden took positions with quiet competence that made chaos calm down around him. Edward looked at the crates, reached in, and began to move food from one world into another, what was once inventory becoming dinner. He listened to a woman explaining rent hikes in a whisper that carried grief, to a boy reading the label on a can as if decoding treasure, to Grace saying, "Try again," the kind of phrase that insults no one and invites again. Between tasks, she spoke softly to Edward. "You see? This is a house too," she said, gesturing to the folding tables, the bulletin board, the tired plants struggling in the window's weak light. "It echoes as well." He nodded. "What do you need?" "Not a donation speech," she said, smiling to soften a truth. "A fridge that doesn't die every third Wednesday. Bus cards. A lawyer on Thursdays who is not tired of being kind." "Done," he said, because he had learned that done is a promise only if you go do it. They worked. They lifted, carried, arranged, listened. When the ESL class resumed, Maria sat in the back with a notebook, sounding out letters under her breath like a child learning humility. Jaden spoke with the director about systems that made people hungry and how to hack them without hurting the people holding the code. Edward wiped a spill without needing a photograph to prove it. When they left, the mural outside seemed newer in the late light. Grace walked them to the door. "You will go back to your tasks," she said, not a question. "Yes," Edward answered, "but my tasks have changed shape." "And I will be here," she said. "Not always in this room, but in rooms like it." He held up the letter. "May I keep this?" "It was sent to be read," she said. "And to be obeyed," he added. She tilted her head. "You will know when you are obeying the letter, and when you are obeying your pride in obeying it. Choose the first." He laughed softly, caught and grateful. "Teacher," he said, and the honorific held. Back at the mansion, evening slowly lit the lamps. The planted bed looked almost invisible in the twilight, the way most beginnings do. In the staff kitchen, the whiteboard bore new checkmarks, garden of hands, ideas now had a column called actions. A chair had been added to the coffee station not as a concession, but as wisdom. On the bulletin board, someone had posted a new photo, a mural of hands planting a tree. Edward placed Grace's letter in a frame on his desk, not as a shrine, but as an instruction manual within reach. He read the last paragraph again and felt the kind of ache that does not wound, it stretches. He took out fresh paper and began a new letter to the board of the foundation, this time asking for specific lines: Cornerstone fridge, bus cards, Thursday lawyer. He wrote quickly, the way men do when procrastination has finally surrendered. In her room at the shelter, Grace sat by a window that faced the street instead of a garden. People passed with their bags and your turns and their I'm trying-s. She brewed tea in a chipped mug with a flower on it that had survived 5 apartments. She opened her Bible and tucked Edward's note, the one he had slipped into her hand at the kitchen stairs, asking her to advise, between the pages of Psalms. "I will, but from here," she said to the air, which doesn't argue, but sometimes agrees. She closed her eyes and saw the mansion's kitchen, the whiteboard, the seeds. She opened them and saw a room full of new students who didn't know yet that they were building something more than vocabulary. The night leaned down. The mansion breathed. The shelter hummed. In 2 different houses, the same sentence formed without sound. Try again. On the small bed in the small room, Grace lay down and smiled into the dark, not because the work was finished, but because the work had finally named her. The city's morning wore a thin coat of dust, the kind that turns sunbeams into visible ladders. Edward drove without the usual hum of talk radio or the low-grade arguments of cable news. Silence did its better work on him now. The letter lay on the passenger seat like a compass that preferred plain paper to magnets. Every stoplight became a small invitation to reread the line about guilt as a tool, not a trophy. He didn't need another mirror. He needed work boots for the soul. At Cornerstone House, a line had already formed, women in thrifted cardigans, men with hands that knew how to lift what wasn't light, a teenager with headphones bouncing a knee fast enough to charge a phone. A chalkboard at the entrance announced, Pantry 9 to 12, ESL 12 to 2, Tenant writes 3 to 5. Someone had drawn a smiling onion and a stern-looking orange with eyebrows to remind volunteers which crate was which. Edward parked and stood a moment on the sidewalk, letting the street confirm he was not the central character here. He adjusted nothing about himself except his posture. He had spent years mastering height. Today, he practiced depth. Inside, the shelter's hum folded him in. He saw Grace at a table, a circle of women around her with notebooks open and pens poised as if preparing for flight. Her voice rose and fell with the cadence of patience that never scolds. Tongue to teeth. Soft, like thanking without the K. Laughter, then a chorus of attempts, the room filling with the music of people learning to name what had always been theirs. He waited until a natural pause. She looked up, saw him, and her greeting arrived in the respectful nod one gives a partner, not a patron. "Mr. Langston." "Edward," he said. "Edward," she repeated, and made it feel less like a correction than a permission. He glanced at the stack of flashcards. "Can I?" "You can separate the vowels we always lose," she said, pointed to a jumble of A, E, I, O, U. They run away from each other. He sat, fingers clumsy at first, arranging letters that had built his life without his noticing their weight. Around him, the shelter's choreography continued. A volunteer with a nose ring called out numbers for the pantry line. A social worker whose shoes had surrendered any dream of fashion handed a man a list of lawyer hours and wrote a star next to Thursday. Someone spilled rice, and someone else swept it up without sighing. A child made a drum of a cereal box and kept in perfect time that somehow steadied adults. When class ended, the women clapped for themselves. Grace clapped with them. She passed out homework, 3 sentences each, one about home, one about hope, one about something they wanted to learn to ask for in a store. Keep the words where you can see them, she said. Tape them to your mirror. Speak them into your soup. A woman with a blue headscarf touched Grace's sleeve. Teacher, she said, searching for the next piece of the sentence. My landlord, bad man. She mimed a lock, a bill, an empty fridge. Tenant writes, Grace said, pointing to the chalkboard and the time. 3 o'clock. I will go with you. The woman's eyes filled, then cleared, gratitude finding its level. Edward watched the exchange and felt something shift in his chest, like a hinge that had been rusted by disuse, now remembering its purpose. He followed Grace to the pantry area. A mountain of onions glowed like modest suns. Oranges waited, fragrant and opinionated. Grace put him on box duty, which he accepted the way a hungry man accepts a bowl. No commentary, just thanks. Maria arrived with a tote bag of labeled bins because labeling made her less afraid. She wore jeans and a sweatshirt, hair braided back, face uncovered. She looked like a person who could be asked to carry something heavy and would say yes without plurals. Jaden flanked her, carrying clipboards and a comm that turned arguments into lists. Bus cards, Jaden said quietly, handing a stack to the coordinator. 30-day passes, and a promise for more next month. The coordinator exhaled like a tire patched at the side of a road that will make it to the next town now. Bless you. Don't bless yet, Jaden said. There's a fridge truck arriving at 4. We'll install today. Grace moved between tasks like a nurse in a ward where love did triage. She taught a volunteer how to weigh produce fairly and how to smile without apology. She reminded a man whose temper flared at the front of the line that hunger was rude first, not people. We'll feed the anger and the body, she told him, but the body first. Around noon, Edward carried boxes to the back room and felt the old ache in his forearms. High school shifts unloading deliveries at the supermarket, the time before his back learned the posture of leather chairs. Sweat found him quickly, and he welcomed it like an honest friend. On his 3rd trip, he saw a stack of flyers, Domestic Workers Legal Aid, Know Your Rights. The headline pried his eye open, and kept it that way. He took one and folded it carefully into his pocket, as if folding a map he'd be asked about later. They ate lunch at a wobbly table near the hallway, plastic bowls of stew that tasted like beans, tomato, and the authority of a hand that knows when enough salt is truth. Edward reached for his wallet, then remembered Grace's letter about donating in the order hunger understands. He kept the wallet in his pocket. He kept his mouth too, using it to ask names, not to tell stories about himself that had aged into noise. The woman with the blue headscarf, Amina, he learned, returned with a child on her hip and a folder of papers that had once seemed to her like a spell cast in a language designed to keep doors shut. 3 o'clock, she told Grace, lifting the folder like a shield. We go, Grace said. Edward looked at his calendar in his mind and found he didn't care where he was scheduled to be. May I join? He asked. Grace studied him for a breath and then nodded. You will stand behind, she said, and be large when largeness is useful, and be quiet when quiet is mercy. His face warmed, in embarrassment at being trained in basic human decency by a woman who had dusted his trophies, and in gratitude at being trained at all. Understood, he said. At 3, they crossed the street to the multi-purpose room, where tenant rights lived on a folding table with a plastic tablecloth that stuck to paper in warm weather. A lawyer in a rumpled blazer, the kind of rumple-honest exhaustion makes, laid out forms, explained city codes with the patience of someone who no longer believed sarcasm ever fed a single soul, and drew simple maps of complicated things. Amina spoke softly. He says rats are not his problem. He says I bring them with my cooking. He says if I do not like, I can leave. She closed her eyes against the idea of leaving. My child is in the school now. I cannot move again. My back is tired. The lawyer nodded, slid a packet across, circled paragraphs. He's in violation. We'll draft a letter. He cannot evict you for requesting repairs, and the city will talk to him. Amina's shoulders lifted and dropped, the body's version of hope. Grace sat beside her, lending steady, without words. Edward stood behind, tall enough to block a draft from the door, quiet enough to let the room forget he was the richest man in it. After outside under a sky that had learned by midday how to be blue, Amina grabbed Grace's hands. "You come Saturday?" she asked. "I make food. I show you how to cook with love." Grace laughed, the sound like a cup set down softly on a saucer. "I will come. Bring your spices. We will trade stories." They parted with promises that felt like rope, not ribbon. Back at Cornerstone, the fridge truck arrived. Jaden coordinated the install with a field manager's efficiency. Maria supervised labeling, and when a volunteer placed milk on a shelf without a first-in, first-out system, Maria showed her a new way that didn't condescend. Edward hauled the old unit to the alley with two men who beat him to it on strength, but let him help on principle. They smiled in a language more universal than English. Sweat jokes, eye creases, the nod of, "You're all right." By late afternoon, the shelter's hum shifted to evening mode. Children woke from naps with the hairdos naps always give. A bulletin board added a new paper, Community Garden Planning Meeting, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Bring hands and a hat. Grace wiped down a table with slow circles that looked almost like prayer. Edward lingered, unsure where to put his hands now that they were not needed. "You're different," she said, not a compliment or a critique, just a weather report. "I feel less like a speech," he answered. She looked at him until he got quieter inside. "Good," she said. "Speeches help when rooms need permission. Work helps when rooms need repairs." He nodded. "I am learning the difference. I want to ask you something." "Ask, but remember I can say no," she said, the insistence of a woman who has earned the right to refuse. "Would you advise the Foundation officially on domestic workers and community support?" He raised a hand. "On your terms. Paid. No token seats at tables. A voice with teeth. And the right to walk away if we start polishing trophies again." She considered, eyes resting on some middle distance that held a schoolroom and a kitchen and a green, stubborn plant. "I will advise," she said at last, "if we agree what advice means." "It means you can tell me when I'm wrong before I make it public," he said. "And you can design programs from the ground up. And we start here, not with a brochure." She smiled. "Then I accept. But my first advice is, do not make me leave my work to do yours. Let me build where I stand." "We will build where you stand," he said. "And I will stand where you build." They shook hands like neighbors agreeing on a fence that would not divide but mark care. As evening pulled its long shadow up the block, they walked to the small lot behind the shelter where someone had drawn crooked squares in chalk to imagine garden plots. Grace knelt and drew a rectangle smaller than the others. "This will be for herbs," she said. "Food with fragrance makes dignity easier." Edward crouched beside her, thumb blackened by the day. "The mansion bed has sprouted," he said. "Spinach. It looked like tiny fists today. Tomorrow they will open." "Send me a picture," she said. "I will," he promised. They stood and watched the street, an old man pushing a cart with his life arranged in logical stacks, a nurse heading to the night shift with her scrubs folded neatly in a tote, a group of teenagers sharing headphones and strategy about a game that had become their country. The world was loud and tender at the same time. Maria joined them, hair messy now in a way that made sense. "I signed up to teach a donation sorting class," she said. "Clotilde says I am bossy in a way that helps." "That is a rare compliment," Grace said. "Frame it." Jaden checked his watch, and then the faces around him. "Tomorrow at 9, he told Edward, the vendor code of ethics meeting. "You'll need stories, not just numbers." "I have stories," Edward said. He nodded toward Grace. "I have a teacher." "Good," Jaden said. "Stories make numbers behave." They closed the shelter together. A volunteer turned the key with the reverence of a sacristan, and the door sighed the way good doors do when they know they have held back more than weather. On the drive back, Edward felt a calm he didn't trust and didn't need to. It was not the old numbness that had let him drive past so much with the volume up. It was the quiet that comes when a choir finally finds the note in their throats and holds it together. He thought of the mansion, of the garden bed that would be dark by now, the seeds underground implementing a strategy older than wealth, push up one fraction at a time without a press release. At home, he walked straight to the staff kitchen. The whiteboard now had an added line under actions, first legal clinic scheduled, Thursday. He wrote under it in his careful, expensive pen, "Foundation to fund clinic monthly." Grace's framed letter stood on his desk. He read the last lines again, smiled, and then took out a new sheet of paper. Grace, picture attached. The spinach opened its little hands today. I watered them like a student reciting. The house is learning. Today, I learned to haul, to stand behind, to separate oranges from onions and pride from obedience. Maria learned the sound of humility in the back of an ESL class. Jaden learned that a fridge installed at 4 can be more important than a headline at 5. Tomorrow we will argue with vendors about dignity, and I will take notes like a man who wants to pass a test that matters. I will not ask you to leave your work to bless mine. Let them braid. If the garden forgets, I will read your letter again. With respect, Edward, he folded the page, placed it by the picture he had printed of small green fists. He would deliver it tomorrow, not by messenger but by hand. Before bed, he went outside and stood by the garden in the dark. The air was soft with autumn's first rumor. He crouched and pressed his palm to the soil the way he had the first time after the gala. It was cooler now, but alive in the quiet way roots announce themselves to those who linger. He whispered into the dirt a sentence that felt less like prayer than like plain speaking. I will keep coming back. Inside, the mansion's echoes continued their gentle revolt. No longer the loop of one man's certainty, they now carried the city in. Grace's measured consonants, Amina's relieved exhale, the thud of a fridge settling into purpose, Maria's newfound laugh unarmored at last, Jaden's pencil scratching a line through later and writing today. The night gathered them all, house and shelter and garden and street, and stitched them into the same blanket. And just before sleep finally took the people who had earned it, the city inhaled. Somewhere a baby cried, and then didn't. Somewhere a window shut. Somewhere a seed decided to split itself open in the dark so that morning could have something new to name. The morning after the fridge installation, the city woke with a sharper edge. Headlines had multiplied overnight, reproducing in tones of skepticism and awe. Billionaire eats in staff kitchen. CEO calls out his own house. Comment sections behaved like weather, windy, sudden rain, pockets of unexpected sun. Edward scanned a few lines and closed his laptop, choosing not to stand in that storm with no coat. He dressed without the usual armor, no cufflinks, no watch that weighed like a small clock on his wrist. He picked up the envelope for Grace with the garden photo and his letter, tucked it into his jacket, and headed downstairs. The staff kitchen hummed with the gentle mechanics of a morning. A kettle announced itself. Bread met heat and responded with a smell that made this house friendlier than it had ever been. Dev was taping a fresh sign above the sink. Please take what you need. Leave what you can. Grace's script had taught the letters how to stand up straight. Morning, Edward said. Morning, sir, Dev replied, then corrected, cheeks pinking, Edward. Edward, he echoed, and it did something to the room's gravity that names were no longer worn like uniforms, but like skin. Jaden texted, vendor code meeting in 40. Bring stories, leave spin. On the way downtown, Edward called a press conference he did not want but would not avoid. Not for theater, he was allergic to his own spotlight now, but because silence had once been his complicity, and he refused to rent it again. He told his team, one room. No curated guest list. Questions allowed. In the vendor meeting, 8 men and women sat around a table that had learned over the years to lacquer compromise. Contracts worth more than school budgets lay in folders with tabs that said efficiency, supply, cost. Edward placed Grace's photo on the table, spinach unfurling, small hands of green. He didn't explain it. He just let it sit there, the world's simplest graph of cause and effect. We're revising our vendor code, he began. Sick leave for your workers. No subminimum subcontracting. Real break times. Food for the people who make our food. Transparent audits. If you can't meet these, we can't meet you. A man in a gray suit looked like a shrug in human form. That's not how it works, Langston. You want to pay more? Fine. But don't tell me how to run my kitchens. I can't tell you how to be, Edward said. But I can tell you who gets our business. An older woman with a pen that clicked in fights said, why now? Because people were hungry under my roof, he answered. And because the people who feed us should eat first. PR stunt, Gray suit murmured. You're confusing lighting with sunshine, Jaden said, voice mild, blade under velvet. This isn't image management. It's policy. We'll pass the extra cost along, another vendor warned. Pass it along to me, Edward said, or pass on this contract. Silence weighed the terms. Some faces calculated. Some faces read a 20-year-old promise to themselves that they had not kept and wondered if tonight could be a good night to begin again. 3 signed. 2 said they'd review. One left with a polite lie about traffic. On the sidewalk afterward, reporters already gathered, mics like flowers thrust at him without fragrance. Edward stepped up, Jaden to his left, Maria to his right, not as props, but as witness. "Mr. Langston, are you shaming other billionaires?" a voice called out. "I am shaming my old self," he said. "If the suit fits others, they can speak for themselves." "Is this sustainable or just fashionable?" another asked. "Fashion is seasonal," he said. "I am changing the climate." "Why now?" a woman asked, and her question lacked the usual casual cruelty. It sounded like someone asking for a recipe. "Because a woman I respect asked for bread without asking," he said. "And because I found out my generosity had been outsourcing its conscience." "Who is she? Can we talk to her?" They smelled a story and wanted to name it. "She's doing her work," he said, "and I won't turn it into content." "That's evasive," someone murmured. "It's protective," he replied. In the afternoon, the boardroom changed key. A cluster of high-profile donors called in, their faces boxed into screens that made their homes look like catalogs. They spoke the language of concern that had learned to pronounce money as if it were a shy child. "Edward, we admire your passion," one said, his jaw spending more energy on composure than truth. "But you're politicizing the foundation." "We're humanizing it," Edward said. Another donor, Pearls, Perfect Lighting, leaned forward. "Domestic workers, are you sure this is the right optics? The stories can get messy. We've built a brand on hope." "Hope that avoids mess," Jaden offered, "is an air freshener." "We're thinking of pausing our annual gift," a third donor admitted, "until we see where this lands." "Gifts that take their courage back at the first sign of wind weren't gifts," Edward said, his tone not scornful, just finished. "They were leases." Several screens flickered in discomfort. One blacked out entirely. Maria watched her father choose integrity over applause and felt the unfamiliar but necessary ache of letting go of people who had only ever clapped for a version of them that did not know how to feel. He didn't chase them. He didn't argue. He returned to the stack of grant proposals that had been moved to the top of a pile: immigration clinics, tenant defense, community kitchens tied to wages, not to whims. He wrote notes in the margins the way a student writes on a book he has decided to love. Fund. Start here. Ask them what we missed. That evening, the foundation hosted a town hall in their own building. No crystal, no dress code, just chairs and microphones and a sign-in sheet that did not ask for income to prove need. The room filled with housekeepers, nannies, dishwashers, day laborers, pastors, teachers, a few men in suits who had heard rumor of a story they wanted to evaluate, and one or two who came to be changed by something they could not yet name. Grace was late. Not fashionably, but functionally. The bus had folded the day into delays. When she entered, the room shifted not because anyone knew her face, but because the air recognized someone who had learned to carry it well. She moved to the front without stepping on anyone's sentences. Edward took the mic and didn't stand at the podium. He stood at floor level. "I have a house," he said, "and for a long time it was an echo chamber for my own voice. I am here to learn the acoustics of a different room." He handed the mic to a woman with red knuckles and a name tag that said Rosa. "I clean 5 houses a week," she said. 3 pay me on time. 2 make me wait and tell me my hours are not real. 1 has cameras and watches me when I eat a sandwich." A murmur that sounded like a protest march hiding in a living room rose and fell. A man in a faded security uniform spoke. "We are told we are family until we ask to be treated like one." A nanny with a gold cross whispered, "I know what your refrigerator looks like. You should know what mine looks like." The room became a psalm of testimony. Grace listened, then took the mic and said, "The first program we build will be the listening one, then the legal one, then the kitchen, then the classroom, or all at once if we can be many." She looked at Edward. "Say what you will do, but not like a promise, like a plan." He nodded and did what he should have done years ago. He enumerated: emergency fund, ombud's office, legal aid clinic, vendor code, wage floor, break room, daycare stipend, kitchen access, education, and a committee of workers to lead all of it. We answer to them. "Who funds it?" someone asked from the back, voice wary from being disappointed. "I do," Edward said, "and anyone brave enough to join." "Why brave?" a young voice asked. "Because courage will cost us invitations to old rooms," he answered. "But it will buy us keys to the rooms we should have built." Not everyone was convinced. A man in a blazer stood, hair sculpted into certainty. "You're creating dependency," he accused, eyes bright with a debate he'd won in classrooms where everyone looked like him. "People need bootstraps." Grace turned and looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student whose textbook has taken his eyesight. "Sir," she said gently, "boots do not feed themselves. And sometimes you need socks before you need straps." Laughter warmed the corners of a room, but it wasn't cruel, it was relief. Afterward, in the low hum of people gathering coats and courage, a reporter cornered Grace. "Can I quote you?" she asked, recorder already up like a reflex. "You may quote the work," Grace said. "Names are heavy. Let them belong to the people doing the lifting." By the time the night thinned into late, Resistance had assembled its counterchoir. A talk show host with a gift for outrage called Edward's Pivot, class warfare wrapped in linen napkins. A columnist wrote that billionaires, playing savior, should start by stepping down. He read the first lines, then stopped, not because he couldn't take a punch, but because he had other sparring partners now. Habit, structure, himself. In the mansion, the staff whiteboard accumulated checkmarks at a rate that humbled everyone. The leak was still fixed. The night shift fruit appeared on time. The quiet room had a lamp that made even exhaustion look held. A photo wall sprouted faces and names, first shyly, then with a little flair. Rita, loves lilies. Dev, future sound engineer. Clotilde, keeps this house breathing. Maria pinned her own picture with a caption that read, "Learning." Edward spent a morning writing letters to the households in his orbit. He told them what he had done wrong, and what he was doing now. He gave them a list. Ask your staff to eat first, give them a pantry key, put chairs where they stand, learn the cost of their shoes, pay the real price for the life you're living. He didn't couch it in generosity. He framed it as rent. The replies were a new planet. Some thanked him. Some cursed him. One old friend called and said, "Don't make me look bad." "I'm asking you to make yourself look good," he answered, and ended the call before they both betrayed the teenager who had promised to be kind someday. He drove to Cornerstone with the envelope for Grace and found her standing in front of a cardboard mock-up of the community garden. Children had drawn tomatoes the size of moons. She laughed when he arrived because he had tracked dirt onto the floor and apologized to it. "I brought what I promised," he said, holding out the picture of spinach and the letter he'd written. She took them and did not hurry the reading. "You watered like a student," she said, smiling at his phrasing. "Good. That means you did not flood them. That's how rich men kill plants." "I am retraining my hand," he said. She turned to the cardboard city. "Tomorrow we break ground," she said. "Bring your fancy shovel." "I will bring the one from the garage," he said. "It knows my weight." They stood side by side, measuring distances with their eyes. Edward felt the old impulse to announce, to cut a ribbon, to invite cameras. He swallowed it and let the moment be small, which is how seeds insist on starting. The reckoning came sharper 2 days later when a group of investors sent a formal letter, lawyered correct, expressing concern about the scope and direction of his initiatives. Attached, a thread in polite clothing, reconsider or face divestment. He printed the letter and brought it to the Garden of Hands, the staff kitchen renamed by marker and consensus. He laid it on the table. Grace, Clotilde, Maria, Jaden, Miguel, Rita, Dev, and 3 others gathered, the room's center of gravity distributed across backs and hands, and a pot of stew. "This will cost us," Edward said. "It should," Clotilde replied. "Things worth keeping charge rent." "What if the board removes you?" Maria asked, fear honest on her face. "Then I will do the work without the chair," he said. "The seat is not the purpose." Grace touched the investor letter, like one touches fabric to see if it will hold. "We cannot eat applause," she said. "We cannot eat threats either. We will eat because we have chosen to cook. Keep cooking." They wrote a response together. Not the legal one, that would be crafted by attorneys and sent by courier, but the moral one, a statement that would go to the public. This is not philanthropy as branding. This is repair. If you prefer your returns without responsibility, there are other portfolios. If you want to profit from a city while ignoring the people who clean its offices and raise its children, you may. But you will not do it here. He signed it. Maria signed it. Jaden signed it. Grace did not sign by choice. "Your names open certain doors and close certain mouths," she said. "Mine opens others. I will use mine where it purchases entry." The press conference that followed was not elegant. The microphone squealed. The room smelled like old coffee. A protest formed on the sidewalk with signs both crude and true. But inside the room, something like dignity thickened the air. Edward read the statement without theatrical pauses. He took questions. He said, I don't know for times and I was wrong, twice, and we will 7 times. People wrote that down because they did not hear it often. A reporter asked, are you converting part of your estate into a community space? Yes, he said. It was supposed to be next week's announcement. It was today's truth. The East Wing. Classrooms, legal offices, childcare, kitchen. The piano stays. Everyone learns. Isn't that extreme? Someone asked. So were my blinders, he said. That night, the mansion did another new thing. It hosted a potluck. Not on marble, not on linen, but in the staff kitchen, and the adjacent hall with folding tables and real flowers cut from a lawn. Rita brought a stew that tasted like weekends in a neighborhood where neighbors still borrow sugar. Miguel brought tortillas that puffed like pride. Dev brought a playlist that refused to choose between continents. Maria brought labels and then forgot to use them. Jaden brought his appetite and his attention. Edward brought a pot of beans that were slightly oversalted and refused to be ashamed of it. They ate and talked and wrote more ideas on the whiteboard until the markers squeaked. A baby fell asleep on a pile of folded aprons. Clotilde told a story about a village where people decided to ring the bell for births louder than for weddings because beginnings deserve more noise. Grace stood at the doorway and watched the room pour itself into its new shape like batter finding a pan. When the night thinned, she slipped out to the garden. The spinach had more than doubled. She knelt and touched a leaf, then looked up to find Edward beside her, hands in his pockets as if he were trying to learn what they were for. This is the reckoning, she said softly. Is not angry. Is patient. It takes your invitations and gives you instructions. It costs you rooms and buys you people. I am happier, he admitted, the word so new in his mouth that it asked for permission, and got it. Not easy, but clean. It will get messy again, she said. We will wash our hands and continue. He nodded. Tomorrow, the East Wing. Tomorrow, she agreed. I will bring chalk. They stood there in the dark yard, listening. The city was not quiet, it was alive. Sirens negotiated with crickets. A bus sighed. Somewhere, a party laughed too loudly. Somewhere else, a woman wrote a rent receipt number on a slip of paper and felt the future wobble, and then steady. In the kitchen, someone wiped the last table. In the shelter, the new fridge hummed like a satisfied animal. In the mansion, the piano waited with its lid up. And under the soil, obedient to no headline and faster than no man, seeds kept doing the arrogant, humble thing they do, break themselves open to grow. They named it quietly, as if not to scare it away, the Garden of Hand Center. No ribbon cutting, no red carpet. Just a morning when the East Wing doors opened, and the air came in without asking what kind of shoes anyone wore. The chandelier there had always been too large, like a laugh told too loud at a funeral. Now it was dimmed to a warm kindness. Rugs replaced marble where feet needed softness. The piano stayed, lid open like a mouth ready to sing, not to show off. A new sign hung where portraits had once judged, painted letters in blues and greens by a local art teacher with paint under her nails. Welcome. This house remembers your names. Edward stood in the threshold with his sleeves rolled, watching people cross into rooms he had once measured by price per square foot. A toddler toddled across a rug worth more than Edward's first apartment and didn't know to fear it, which meant the rug was finally serving the child, not the other way around. He took a breath and realized the East Wing smelled different now. Coffee, paper, citrus, detergent that didn't bite, warm bread, a faint whisper of rosemary from little pots growing in windows. Grace arrived with a tote bag full of chalk, flashcards, a worn Bible, a tin with biscuits that wasn't for display, and a set of laminated name tags she'd made by hand. Good morning, she said to the room, but the room understood she was speaking to every morning after this one, too. Maria posted station labels with tape that didn't peel paint. ESL 1, ESL 2, tenant rights clinic, childcare nook, quiet room, shoe swap, garden plans, story wall. Jaden brought a folding whiteboard and wrote the day's schedule with a hand steady as a carpenter's. Clotilde stood at the door like a basilica's saint, except her halo was a hairnet and her blessing was a ladle. Soup at noon, she said, and the rice waits for no one. They had made classrooms out of former guest suites, beds moved out, tables brought in, books stacked where silk had once slept. A legal aid office occupied the corner room with the best light. File cabinets lived where a drinks cart had once encouraged a different kind of forgetting. The childcare nook had a rocking chair by the window that looked onto the garden, so babies would learn early that green sustains. The first workshop began with Grace handing out name tags and a smile that stepped back so others could come forward. "Write your name as you want us to call you," she said. "If it is long, we will learn it long. If it is short, we will treat it like a whole poem." Women and men wrote carefully, some letters shy, some proud. Amina arrived in her blue headscarf with her child and a container that steamed with invitation. "For later," she said, slipping it into Clotilde's hands as if passing a secret. "Thank you," Clotilde said. "This house believes in later." Edward lingered near the piano, which no longer intimidated him now that it had decided to be furniture again. A child hit middle C, then smiled wide at the way sound owned space without asking. The House That Learned to Listen. He heard the title in the key, like a refrain. He touched the wood lightly. "You'll learn simpler songs," he told it, "and that will be your genius." He carried chairs to ESL1. Grace had arranged the room, so no one sat at the back by force. Circles undid hierarchy without speeches. "Today," she began, "we learn words that carry requests across rooms." She wrote "may I," "please," "I need," "I'm not finished," "I deserve" in her neat hand. "Say them like you trust them," she said. "Say them like they were always yours." Voices rose, first hesitant, then strong. Edward stood by the door, holding a box of pencils, feeling like a doorman for dignity. When a woman struggled over th, Grace made a joke about the tongue forgetting it was a neighbor to teeth, and the room laughed itself freer. Words took root faster over laughter. In the legal office, a volunteer attorney explained the difference between notice and threat, the shape of a city ordinance, the way a letter becomes a wall, when stamped just right. Maria took notes, then realized the people did not need her to translate. They needed her to fetch the right forms and not get in the way. She did that work well, and the work did something back to her. It scraped away the lacquer she had used as personality and left wood that could hold weight. Jaden had stacked grant proposals in the corner, community gardens, worker co-ops, a laundromat that would pay above minimum and let employees take home soap. He toggled between spreadsheets and faces, a rare kind of math. He called vendors and kept them honest with stories, not statistics, because he had learned that one widow's rent receipt could reorder a whole supply chain faster than a pie chart ever could. The story wall went up at noon. Maria started it with her own picture, a candid of her carrying donated bins, hair escaping its tidy plan. Underneath she wrote, "Maria, practicing bravery." Dev posted his. Dev, sound engineer in progress, stacks plates like music. Miguel pinned a photo of a tomato. He grew the size of a softball. Miguel makes lawns confess they want to be gardens. Clotilde square red. Clotilde, older sister of this house, keeper of spoons, friend of truth. Grace didn't pin her own. She coaxed others. Amina's photo, taken in the kitchen at Cornerstone, went up with Amina, mother, bread baker, fighter of rats and landlords. A security guard in a uniform threadbare at the elbows wrote, "Samuel, night watch, daydreamer, knows every exit and the way in." The wall gathered them, a choir learning to see itself in its own frame. At noon, the house learned the sound of soup bowls on wood, a rhythm poor houses have always known and rich ones often forget to enjoy. Clotilde poured, and people ate on chairs that no longer flinched. Edward tried not to hover. He failed twice, succeeded on the third attempt, and then just sat, chewing, listening. Grace spoke to a woman about pronouncing schedule like a soft secret. Maria laughed with a nanny about toddlers and their hallucinations of fairness. Jaden consulted with the lawyer about a case that needed more daylight than cash. After lunch, Grace slipped into the quiet room. It was small, 2 chairs, a lamp with a shade that made warm circles, a shelf with a few books, poetry, prayer, a battered novel that had passed through more hands than any one person could trace. She sat and put her fingers to her temples, not because she was tired, though she was, but because the day's noise had been holy, and even holy sound asks for silence to be fully heard. Through the wall, the piano offered to slow him. She whispered a thank you that did not need a title before it. Edward stood alone in the hallway of his old life, that gallery of oil portraits, before they were relocated to a more honest wing. He looked at his grandfather's face in paint and wondered what the man would say to this day. He answered himself. He would say the house has become a church. He would not like it. "I do." He spoke it aloud. "I do." The portrait did not argue. Edward felt himself let go of a hand that had never held him and take another that did. In the late afternoon, the east wing filled with a tremor that was not fear, it was presence. People came from the shelter, from the bus stop, from shifts that left their bodies sullen, but their hearts still available to learn. A tenant meeting spilled from the legal office into the hall. Someone programmed the coffee machine to treat everyone like VIPs. Children drew a picture of the house with bright windows and figured out perspective without being told. Maria led a short session on organizing, her voice unsure for exactly 7 minutes, and then finding its own ground. Put the heavy things at the bottom, she said, moving donations into cents. Label what matters. Throw away the shame. People clapped because they recognized a parable hiding in logistics. Jaden coordinated a call with 3 other CEOs who had asked for a playbook, and then recoiled when they saw it required sleeves. We're not talking optics, he said evenly. We're talking payroll and plumbing. One hung up. One sighed. One stayed. Jaden smiled. One is enough to start a choir. Grace ended her last ESL session with a small graduation that wasn't an end. She gave out certificates she had printed on the office copier, names lettered by her hand, because paper sometimes opens doors that people's dignity should have opened already. People took photos. The room learned the sound of pride that cost no one else their seat. Near dusk, Edward walked the garden with Miguel and Grace. The spinach had grown from little fists into open palms. Basil leaves quivered, ready for picking. The air smelled like evening cooling its temper. This will feed more than salads, Miguel said, proud and modest, the best pairing. It already does, Grace answered. She plucked a leaf and rubbed it between finger and thumb, held it under Edward's nose. The scent lifted something in him he had not known was heavy. Smell that. That's an old him. They sat on the low wall, a trinity of intention. The man who had owned too much, the woman who had carried too much, the gardener who had coaxed too much from indifferent soil. Silence arranged itself comfortably between them. Today, Edward said, I heard this house sing. Grace smiled. It learned harmony. You let it. He shook his head. You taught it. We taught it, she corrected. Even the walls want a good story. The evening class began in the big room, where the piano waited. Grace had coaxed a young teacher from Cornerstone to lead a reading circle. Chairs creaked politely. People folded themselves into attention. Maria slid into a seat beside Rita. Jaden leaned against the doorframe like a friendly exclamation point. Before the reading, a small ceremony, the house that learned to listen would have its first story share. Grace stood with a notebook. If you want to read a piece of your life into this room, she said, the room will carry it softly. Amina spoke about the first night the rats didn't come because the landlord had been forced to call pest control. Laughter the size of relief filled the corners. Samuel told of a child who waved at him every night from a window and how it made the darkness shorter. Rita recounted the first time a guest asked her name before handing her a coat and how she nearly cried into the lining. Dev read a lyric he'd scribbled on a clipboard between dish loads about steam and dreams and the rhythm of stacks. Then Edward unexpectedly stood. He pulled from his pocket the folded eviction notice they had kept pinned to a corkboard like a talisman for 2 months when he was a boy. The paper was brittle as autumn leaves. My mother laughed when she got this, he said softly, because she had forbidden herself to cry. I stole a loaf of bread that night. I told her I found it. She cut it into small pieces and blessed it with her hands. He looked up. I have been dividing bread ever since badly. Today I learned how to share. Silence held him. Not the cold kind that leaves you naked, but the warm kind that wraps around a confession so it doesn't shiver. Grace stepped forward and took the paper like a priest takes the offering, acutely aware of both the cost and the future it might fund. She placed it on the piano, under the lid, where the sound could learn it by heart. Outside, the sky turned indigo. The first star offered itself without bragging. In the kitchen, Clotilde's ladle rested. The bottom of the soup pot showed like a clean floor. People drifted toward the door, not because they were being shooed, but because good rooms teach you how to leave with more than you brought. Maria found Grace near the story wall. I used to think houses are for showing, she said. Now I see they're for sheltering. And for listening, Grace added. And for learning to say names long, Maria said, smiling at her own education. Say mine, Grace teased. Grace and Lovu, Maria said, each syllable a step she refused to rush. Thank you, Grace said, and it landed in the exact place thanks is meant to land, between 2 people, not at their feet. Jaden walked up with an email on his phone. 3 more vendors signed, he reported. One offered to fund a staff pantry in every site they manage. I told them no pantries without wages, but yes to both. Numbers that finally listen, Grace said. Numbers that can sing, Jaden corrected, and they laughed at the math. When the last light went out in the East Wing, the house did not return to being a museum. It became a memory factory. The piano held Edward's old paper and hummed quietly to itself like would dreaming. The classroom smelled like marker, ink, and courage. The legal office's file cabinets slept like armored saints after a long day of mercy. Edward walked alone down the main corridor, footsteps softer than they had ever been. He paused at the door of the quiet room. Inside, the lamp's amber halo made the chairs look like friends. He sat and thought of his mother blessing bread, of a garden where a woman ate grass, of a letter that told him not to polish shame, of a shelter that smelled like 1,000 small beginnings. He did not pray because he had not decided what to call his reaching. He simply reached. When he rose, he went to the garden. The spinach leaves held little pockets of night where water would be in the morning. He knelt and pressed his palm to the soil one more time. That private ritual he was not finished with. "Thank you for teaching me," he said to the ground, to the house, to the woman who had taught him, to the people who had come, to himself for not running at the first sign of cost. He walked back in and found Grace at the exit, checking locks not for fear, but to honor the day. "Tomorrow," he asked. "Tomorrow," she said. "Bring more chairs. The room will grow." "The room," he asked. "The people," she corrected. They parted with a nod that was better than a hug because it promised presence without taking anyone's hands away from their work. The mansion settled. The shelter across town dimmed its lights. In the city, a bus was late, a siren changed its mind mid-cry, a block exhaled. The house that learned to listen listened even in sleep. It held the day's words in its beams, and the day's laughter in its vents, and the day's decisions in its stares. And long after midnight, when only the moon kept minutes, the center of the East Wing murmured back to itself the sentence that had built it. "Welcome. This house remembers your names." By the time winter remembered to loosen its hand, the city had learned a new rhythm. The East Wing opened each morning as if it were an eyelid, and the shelter's fridge hummed with the quiet pride of something that refused to die every third Wednesday. Buses arrived late and still delivered courage. The garden of hands center breathed like a lung. Inhale, exhale, names in, dignity out. When the sun slid higher, the raised beds behind the mansion held their own small, bright congregation. Spinach, basil, collards, rosemary, a row of tomatoes that had no business being that red in April and insisted anyway. Grace arrived early with a basket and a pencil behind her ear, the look of a woman who carried both field and chalkboard in the same body. She ran her fingertips along the spinach leaves, cool as the inside of a church. "You've been patient," she told them, and their green answered by offering itself. She cut with a small knife, not a theft but a promise redeemed. Edward walked out slowly, a scarf at his throat, a new softness around the eyes. He had been to a doctor 2 weeks ago, and come home with a list: rest, fiber, less salt, more walking that had nothing to do with lobbies and deal rooms. The news had not frightened him. It had clarified him. He moved like a man who no longer confused speed with importance. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Grace returned, without looking up. "Step where the soil is dry. We are not trampling anyone on their first day." He obeyed, smiling. "Teacher," he murmured. She passed him a basket and did not explain. He didn't need the instruction anymore. He cut leaves with the reverence of someone turning pages he'd once torn. Soon their baskets were full. Rosemary perfumed the air like a whispered psalm. Miguel waved from the tomatoes and held up a giant as if he'd hauled in a fish. "For the ceremony," he called. "What ceremony?" Edward asked. "The kind where food becomes story," Grace said, already walking toward the kitchen door. Inside, the East Wing moved in its accustomed choreography. Maria checked the day's schedule with a highlighter that had learned restraint. Jaden skimmed financials at a side table, a bowl of berries beside him, budgeting with the kind of joy you learn when numbers finally align with a life you can defend aloud. Clotilde stirred a pot so big it looked like a memory of every pot before it. Children colored on the floor under a sign that read, "Please put the crayons back where they sleep when you are done." On the story wall, photos had multiplied until the board became a mosaic of faces the house could not forget even if it tried. New squares, Amina standing in front of a stove with an open smile and no rats, Samuel at a day game, eyes squinting at sunlight he had earned, Dev, in a small recording booth the size of a closet, headphones on, captioned, "First track mixed at midnight after dish shift." In the legal office, a volunteer lawyer, no longer rumpled with defeat but deliberately casual, reviewed a case with a woman who stood a little taller after listening. In the ESL room, Grace wrote a new phrase on the board, "We built this." She underlined it. "Say it," she said, and the class did, the sentence fitting better each time like a shoe that finally learned the shape of its wearer. At noon, people began to gather with empty containers and full stories. The spinach had a destination. The shelter's kitchen would share a harvest meal with the mansion. 2 rooms tasting the same green at the same hour, the city's invisible line drawn, and then erased by soup. Buses deposited aunties in bright head wraps, teenagers whose earbuds sang private hymns, men with hands that told you their jobs without a word. Donors came, too, new ones with less jewelry and more questions. A few of the old kind returned humble, asking for a seat with less view and better company. Grace found a place for everyone. That was her gift, not the miracle of multiplying loaves, but the discipline of multiplying chairs. Edward's phone buzzed. The screen showed a familiar name, one of the investors who had once threatened divestment. He silenced it and slid the phone into a drawer. Some sounds are less important than soup. "Ready?" Maria asked, stepping into the doorway with a stack of real plates. "Paper feels wrong today." "We are what we serve on," Clotilde said, approving. They carried bowls out in procession, not pomp. The first ladle belonged to a woman whose English had grown bold in 5 months. She wore a name tag that said Evelyn, though the Y had insisted on becoming a flower. The second to a man with careful hands who had repaired the leak, so well the wall forgot its cough. The third to a teen who had passed her driving test with directions spoken slowly in the ESL room, and who now delivered food across town on a schedule that paid her fairly. Edward took a seat at a folding table between Miguel and Samuel. He did not hover or arrange. He ate, and in eating he joined. The spinach was bright and honest in the mouth, the quiet taste of chlorophyll reminding the body what sunlight becomes when the right hands intervene. Around him, voices layered and overlapped, a choir with no conductor and perfect pitch. Grace stood to speak only when the room's conversation found its natural rest. "We planted these seeds when the air was cold," she said, not raising her voice, trusting everyone would lean in. "We watered day after day, when nothing changed above ground. We fed the soil. We got our hands dirty. We looked silly sometimes kneeling in front of a lawn that thought itself too pretty for food. Today we eat from that stubbornness. Today we invite everyone who once said no to taste the yes we grew." She looked to the far end of the room, where a small knot of men and women had clustered, the ones who had opposed the shift, who had laughed on television, who had posted vague thoughts about personal responsibility. They had come, faces taught to respect rooms they didn't own. Grace lifted a bowl and walked it to them herself. "Welcome," she said. "Eat. Then help us wash the dishes." Laughter rippled, then turned to something softer. The visitors took their bowls with hands that remembered childhood kitchens and forgot performance for a full minute. A bell chimed, not a church bell, but the piano with a finger pressed gently by Dev, signaling the first of the afternoon's small ceremonies. Children lined up, each holding a sprig of rosemary like a green wand. "For the garden," they said, and tucked their offerings into little pots near the windows. Amina read a poem she had written in English and the language of her childhood, the 2 tongues braiding seamlessly without argument. Jaden announced the launch of the Worker Legal Defense Fund, named after a woman who had once folded napkins into lilies while hiding her pain. Maria introduced a program that would subsidize childcare for night shift and then, almost shyly, admitted she had built the schedule around a toddler's nap rhythm shared by half a dozen mothers. "We're not designing in a vacuum," she said. "We're designing around life." Edward stood last, not with a speech, but a story. He held up his mother's bread knife, a plain thing with a wooden handle, the blade small nicks down its length. "I took this from my first apartment when I left home," he said, smiling at his younger self. "It cut loaves we could barely afford. It cut birthday cakes made of cornbread. It cut apples that tasted like winning. Today it cut spinach quiche for a room that taught me how to feed people without needing to feel large while doing it." He set the knife down. "If I ever start to polish gilt again, someone please take this from me and hand me a sponge." "You will have to pry it from me," Clotilde said, and the room laughed like family. Late afternoon, the shelter across town lifted its own spoons. The fridge stayed steady. A bulletin board held new flyers. The garden there, a chalk outline dream 2 months ago, now burst with promise in raised beds built from scavenged wood and stubborn hope. When the time came, volunteers carried trays from the east wing to the shelter, and trays from the shelter returned to the mansion. It was an exchange of flavor and effort, pride wrapped in aluminum foil and bound with twine. Between the trips, Edward walked the perimeter of the garden with grace. His breath shortened once, a reminder that his body contained its own agenda. He stopped, hand to his chest, not in panic, but in respect. Grace watched him the way you watch weather, attentive, unafraid. "I'm all right," he said. "I know," she replied. "You are learning new pacing. Pride sprints. Mercy knows marathons." He nodded, the lesson entering him deeper than oxygen. "I used to think dying scared me," he said, surprising himself. "Now I think I was afraid of living badly." "And now?" she asked. "Now I am busy," he said, smiling, breath returning. "And not with myself." They reached the spinach bed. Children knelt and picked carefully, pretending not to hear the instruction to avoid tearing roots. "We will plant collards next," Miguel said. "They are like stubborn uncles, hard to shake." "And hungry children love them when you add enough garlic," Grace replied. A boy in a red sweatshirt tugged Edward's sleeve. "Mr. Ed," he said, ignoring the second syllable on purpose, "can I play the piano?" "You can," Edward said, "but only if you teach me one note." The boy led him inside and showed him middle C again, as if the man might have forgotten. Edward pressed it. The note rose, hovered, returned as echo, and brought with it the murmur of a dozen conversations, a clink of plates, a sniffle quickly overtaken by laughter. The house held the sound, then let it go, new air making room for the next. Toward evening, the rooms thinned. People left with containers labeled in Grace's tidy script. The legal office lamp clicked off. The childcare nook gathered toys back into baskets without judgment. The garden exhaled a coolness that asked for sweaters. Under the big oak, a long table appeared with a plain white cloth, the kind that looks fancy only when honesty sits on it. This was the closing of the day, harvest dinner. Shelter staff, mansion staff, neighbors, donors who had earned their return, vendors with revised contracts and surprised expressions, even a reporter who had put down her recorder the way some people put down their weapons. They ate what they had grown and what they had traded, spinach, tomatoes, bread that remembered every hand, stew that did not apologize for being simple. Someone started a song, an old hymn that had learned to lean into new chords, and the house sang along imperfectly, which made it better. When the plates were pushed back and the flies gave up, Grace stood. She didn't raise her arms. She didn't have to. "Thank you," she said. "Not for coming. That is the beginning. Thank you for staying long enough to be useful." She looked at Maria and Jaden. "You will carry this forward when our hands are tired." She looked at Edward. "You will sit sometimes and watch us do it without you. That will be your graduation." He swallowed and nodded, loving the humility she asked of him more than any applause he used to crave. "Gladly," he said. "Before we end," Grace continued, "one more errand." She lifted a basket and walked it to the group of critics-turned guests. "We keep a basket at the door," she said. "You are welcome to take and to leave. Generosity is not sentimental here, it is circular." She turned, hands open now. "If there is someone in your old rooms who is hungry, the kind that keeps the face polite and the stomach noisy, bring them next time. But bring them like friends, not like exhibits. We will feed what needs feeding." The man in the blazer who had once argued bootstraps took the basket. He looked around like a person learning a dialect, then nodded, not grudging but changed. "I'll be back," he said, and the room answered with the sound hope makes when it believes you. Night bloomed gentle. Lights came on in the east wing, warm and human. The piano slowed its breathing. Children slept in laps that had earned a rest. The Garden of Hands Center began the quiet business of putting itself away without losing its soul. Edward and Grace walked to the garden one last time. He sat on the low wall. She stood, hands on hips, looking over the beds the way a teacher looks at a classroom after everyone has gone, seeing not the scuffs and crumbs but the learning, still invisible and alive. "Do you remember the first morning?" he asked. "In the garden." "I remember the taste," she said, "of grass, of shame." She turned to him. "I do not taste it now." "Neither do I," he said. "I taste salt and tomatoes and a future that is not afraid of me." She smiled at that. "Good. Then you are feeding the right hunger." He nodded toward the house. Sometimes I think the walls lean in. They do, she said. Even wood can repent. He laughed softly, and the sound trailed off into the kind of silence that is not empty. Fireflies began their small, bright arguments with the dark. Somewhere a siren remembered it had other places to be and left them alone. Maria approached, linking her arm through Grace's, a gesture so natural now no one felt the miracle. Jaden says we can fund the childcare for the next year, she said. And the legal clinic has volunteers fighting to get on the schedule. I didn't know people would want this much to help. People always wanted, Grace said. They just needed a door. Edward stood, a little slower, not ashamed. I will go in, he said. I will sit and watch. Good, Grace said. You will see that we do not need you to lead, only to love. I can do that, he said. I'm getting very good at being useful, without being central. Is a high art, she answered, and easier on the heart. They parted with the small nod that had become their benediction. Edward went inside. Grace lingered, fingers brushing the rim of the spinach bed, like a mother's hand counting breaths. She looked up at the sky, black and generous, and whispered the old teacher's closing line. Class dismissed. See you tomorrow. In his study, Edward read her letter again, the one that had started his real life, and placed it back in its frame. He penned a small note beneath it, obeyed today. He turned off the light and walked to the east wing. The quiet room lamp glowed like an ember. He sat a moment and did nothing so thoroughly that it qualified as prayer. The city settled. At the shelter, the fridge kept its promise. On a block that had cried for years, laughter slipped out a window. In a penthouse far away, someone who had mocked this work set down his drink and felt, inexplicably, that he ought to call his housekeeper by her full name. In the richest garden in the city, the spinach slept, and beneath it the soil rehearsed tomorrow. Grace closed the gate and headed home with a basket for the shelter's breakfast. The moon walked her block like a friend. Some stories end with applause. This one ended with dishes, washed, dried, returned to their shelves. With a child waking briefly, being held, and sleeping again. With a man placing a hand on a table he once thought proved his worth, and finding it now sturdy enough to hold the weight of many lives. And with a sentence Grace would say again months later, standing in a classroom, rolling chalk between finger and thumb, as if it were a seed, some hunger teaches us what money can never feed.